Holy Priesthood Vol. 4. Ogden Kraut. The History and Law of Plural Marriage. We have got to observe at plural marriage. It is an eternal principle and was given by way of commandment and not by way of instruction. Joseph Smith, Contributor 5259. August 1995. Preface. Many volumes have been written by both LDS and non-LDS authors on polygamy or plural marriage. The subject has been approached from about every angle imaginable, but this book considers it from the aspect of being a law of the Holy Priesthood. Also included are brief histories about many different nations, cultures and individuals who have benefited from its practice. Polygamy has been lived by people throughout the world for a variety of reasons, and it's interesting to note that many benefits, other than spiritual, can be derived from such a lifestyle. However, as a doctrine of the priesthood, the primary considerations are the spiritual and temporal blessings that come from living the law in a righteous and godlike manner. Like any other principle or doctrine of the priesthood, plural marriage can be a blessing or a cursing, depending upon the manner in which it is used or abused. Unfortunately, since its restoration through Joseph Smith down to the present time, it has not been difficult to find countless incorrect examples of plural marriage, which is evidence of the fact that it is not an easy religious principle to live, nor is it intended for everyone. Since it is classified as one of the higher laws and doctrines of the priesthood, greater blessings are available for its adherents, and greater punishments for its abuse. Celestial plural marriage is an eternal law of the priesthood, revealed by God, and throughout history, there are times when the church organization itself has adopted it as a tenet of their faith. However, because of the inability of the saints as a whole to righteously live this law, its acceptance is relatively short-lived within the ecclesiastical framework, and it once again becomes an individual decision. Though it can be discontinued as an accepted practice of the church, it cannot be removed as an eternal law of the Holy Priesthood. Contents. Preface. 1. Introduction. 7. The Search for Truth. 2. Adam and Eve. 10. Adam brought one of his wives. 3. The Romans. 14. The Monogamy Law. 4. The Africans. 22. A variety of polygamy cultures. 5. The Hindus. 35. India law changed from polygamy to monogamy. 6. The Islams. 43. The polygamous solution in Arabia. 7. The Hebrews. 58. Blessings of Bible polygamists. 8. The Jews. 69. Polygamy increases their population. 9. The Nephites. 77. Polygamy not for the wicked. 10. The Christians. 89. Christ fulfilled the law. 11. The Catholics. 100. Polygamy against secular and ecclesiastical law. 12. The Munsters. 131. Defended polygamy with their lives. 13. The Reformers. 144. Polygamy more secret than public. 14. The Americans. 174. Land of religious freedom. 15. The Mormons. 189. The restoration of plural marriage. 16. Conclusion. 229. A principle, ordinance, covenant, and law. Chapter 1. Introduction. The Search for Truth. Recognizing and honoring truth is far more important than abiding by traditions and customs. If one system has more evidence of truth and righteousness than another, then certainly we ought to condone it, rather than condemn it. Our American Christian marriage system has taught us that monogamy is right and polygamy is wrong. But as James Campbell said, these prejudices are neither natural nor inveterate, but that they have been induced by the corrupted Christianity of the medieval priesthood, and that they will be removed when Christian people become better informed. History and Philosophy of Marriage, Campbell, pages 23 to 24. The Latter-day Saints, more than anyone else on earth, should study and understand the nature, history and truth pertaining to the laws of monogamy and polygamy. For them it can mean exaltation or damnation, because marriage is a law of the Holy Priesthood and a major factor in our religion. Plural marriage has been practiced in China, India, Middle East, Arabia, Africa, Indonesia, Australia, portions of Europe, among the Indians and Eskimos, as well as in the United States. In fact, it has been stated that people in 80% of all 853 cultures have at some time practiced plural marriage. See Ethnology, Murdoch and White, pages 329 to 369. They could see real and practical advantages to such a lifestyle, as the following excerpt illustrates. In societies that have a long tradition of polygyny, one man having two or more wives, women appear to welcome co-wives. A co-wife not only affords companionship and shares the labor, but her presence indicates that the family is sufficiently wealthy to have this luxury. Indeed, a principal function of polygyny is to increase the wealth of the family, and thereby its social importance. Moreover, where labor is scarce, co-wives may increase the wealth of the family. For example, among the Blackfoot Indians, polygyny increased with the transition of fur trading from beaver to buffalo. Tanning the buffalo skins was the exclusive labor of women, and the more wives a man had, the greater his financial potential. Polygyny also absorbs an excess of marriageable women, particularly in instances where wars have decimated the male population. In addition, it allows older men to marry youthful and attractive younger women. In ancient times, polygyny was practiced in Egypt, among the Hebrews, in Arabia, and in Ireland, as it was, until modern times, in China and Japan, in the form of concubinage. In the societies of Abyssinia, plural marriages were legal, but were common only among the most affluent. Encyclopedia Americana, 1995 ed. 22 365. Whether we base our investigation on the laws of God, which is the purest form of truth, or on the laws of nature, these two sources alone should be proof enough to convince us of what is closest to the truth. On the other hand, traditions and customs are the worst sources of truth, even though they are the most popular. Both the laws of God and laws of nature often differ materially from civil, social, and federal laws. The former are consistent and infallible, the latter are often conflicting, confusing, altered, amended, or repealed. This is nowhere more noticeable than regarding the laws pertaining to marriage. Here in the Western world we have inherited the monogamous marriage system with very little study into its origins, practice, or disadvantages. We know even less about polygamy, most information coming from a few Bible stories, and a little from the Eastern nations, and most of that is received with prejudice and contempt. In the spirit of fair play, both sides of history should be studied with an unbiased and inquiring mind, with the object of learning truth. Matrimony, and the civil and moral laws pertaining to it, have historically been complex and varied. There are also many forms of marriage lifestyles, such as monogamy, celibacy, polygamy, polygyny, bigamy, polyandry, common law, concubinage, and more recently same-sex. Numerous moral deviations exist as to the union of the sexes, such as fornication, adultery, prostitution, homosexuality, sodomy, etc. Because there are so many marriage and sexual variations, it is important for us to learn how God views marriage and the proper matrimonial relationships between man and woman. So let's start at the beginning. Chapter 2. Adam and Eve. The Garden of Eden. The marriage system among the nations should be determined according to the laws of God, not by men in government. Since the days of the Garden of Eden, man was given the power and responsibility to govern his household. His home is his castle, and he is king. From Mother Eve to the modern-day career girl, woman has been instructed that she is not to act in a governing role in the marriage relationship. A properly organized family cannot have two heads. When the devil tempted Eve, he did it with many truths. He said that as she would partake of the tree of knowledge, several good things would result. 1. She would not die. 2. Her eyes would be opened. 3. She would be as the gods. 4. She would know good and evil. 5. The tree was good for food. 6. It was pleasant to the eyes. 7. It would make her wise. See Gen. 3:4-6. Such temptation had every element of truth within it, but she was told not to partake of it. In other words, something can be good but be forbidden. Dr. Adam Clark stated, "There is a rule for all things, there are in fine fixed and stated limits, on either side of which righteousness cannot be found. On the line of duty alone we must walk. Such limits God certainly assigned from the beginning. Thou shalt come up to this, thou shalt not pass it. And as he assigned the limits, so he assigned the means. It is lawful for thee to acquire knowledge in this way, it is unlawful to seek it in that." Adam Clark's Commentary, 151. In other words, whatever God says is right should be obeyed. Every logical and reasonable deviation may sound right and be very tempting, but it may be wrong. Our duty is to obey the law of God. The serpent went only to Eve to present his temptation. Why didn't he go to both Adam and Eve at the same time? Did he think she was weaker than Adam? Regardless, when Eve presented it to her husband, he accepted it. The man was tempted by the woman, not the serpent. For what reason was this story told? Was it to show man that his greatest temptation can come from a woman? Was it to show him that the woman should not lead the man? One thing is certain, both were cursed. Adam with regard to the ground being cursed for his sake, and Eve that her desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. Gen. 3:16. This marriage order was for the man as much as the woman. If he should let the woman lead, then he transgresses the law. Another underlying principle in a man's not allowing a woman to lead is that he would be putting his trust in the arm of flesh. Such a weakness can be spiritually fatal. Conversely, a woman should not blindly follow her husband either. These seemingly minor infractions of that law could become a serious problem to both in their marriage. Temptation is often accompanied with dozens of logical reasons, truths and half-truths, to lead one away from obedience to God's law. The prophet Joseph Smith said, "Whatever God requires is right, no matter what it is, although we may not see the reason thereof till long after the events transpire." TPJS, page 256. This means that our own logic, reason and calculations cannot always be a true indication of the course that we should pursue. The only proper path in life is by obedience to the commandments and revelations of God. The fact that man should live by every word that proceedeth forth from the mouth of God applies to marriage relationships as much as it does to anything else. Most marriage laws have been based on Adam and Eve's reportedly monogamous marriages recorded in the Bible. However, since they were not born into mortality as the rest of mankind, their apparent monogamous marriage may have been different, too. Adam's life before coming to this mortal sphere may well have included other wives, which teaching was strongly advocated by Brigham Young. When our father Adam came into the Garden of Eden, he came into it with a celestial body and brought Eve, one of his wives, with him. He helped to make and organize this world. JD 150. Both monogamists and polygamists used the same passages in Genesis to defend their positions. An interesting perspective was presented by Johann Lacer, who argued that since God created woman from a man's rib, and since he has several ribs, a man should obviously have several wives. He also argued that the Bible says a man cannot have two masters, but it never said a master cannot have two servants. He also said it has always been the divine right of kings to be given the most beautiful damsels from all of his provinces. As quoted in After Polygamy Was Made a Sin, Cairncross. Also included in Genesis are numerous stories of the greatest Bible prophets who lived plural marriage. This means they did not pattern their lives after the figurative account of Adam and Eve's so-called monogamous marriage. How could those ancient prophets have walked and talked with God if their plural marriages were a sin? In fact, Abraham, the father of the faithful, did not walk and talk with God until after he entered into plural marriage. To some, there seems to be a conflict, then, in approved Bible marriage systems, and for centuries it has been disputed among nations and religions. The next several chapters will discuss some of these beliefs and practices among various societies of the world. Chapter 3. The Romans. The monogamy law. Although monogamy goes back to the beginning of time, specific laws enforcing it go back to only about 2,500 years ago in the Roman Empire. The date and origin of the first settlement on the present site of Rome are obscure, although legends name Romulus as the city's founder in 753 BC sometime during the 8th century BC. Various tribes that had lived on the original 7 hills were united under the rule of Etruscan kings, who remained dominant until late in the 6th century BC, when the Romans overthrew Etruscan rule and established the Republic. Rome developed as the capital of one of the ancient world's largest and most prosperous empires. American People's Encycl. 16148. And so did their laws, notably those regulating and restricting monogamy within their empire. The supposed original founders of Rome were Romulus and Remus, twins who started the city on the Palatine Hill. The early Roman settlers were a tribe of outlaws, murderers, and society rejects who made their living by plunder and robbery. The 7 hills of Rome became their hideout and were a perfect place to settle, as the communities they plundered found it difficult to locate them or to penetrate their defenses. But as these outlaws began to increase in numbers and wealth, they realized there was something missing: women. To solve this problem, they decided to kidnap some from a nearby community called the Sabines. So they planned a special festival to provide the opportunity to carry out their plan. The famous rape of the Sabines occurred during this period of legendary history. Romulus, having found it difficult to obtain wives for his followers who were rather notorious as runaways and malefactors, invited the Sabines to a feast and games. During the games, The garrison of the Palatine seized the unsuspecting and unprotected Sabine women, whom they carried off to be their wives. American People's Inc. 16232. Such acts of kidnapping and rape were enough to start a war, which they did. But there was an ameliorating factor which soon resulted in a peace agreement. It came from the women themselves. Because of these pleadings, the king of the Sabines, Titus Tatius, made an alliance with Romulus. The ensuing war between Romans and Sabines was ended through the mediation of the Sabine women, and the Romans and Sabines joined into one community. Ibid. 16149. This ended the hostilities that broke out after the rape of the Sabine women by Romulus's followers. Rome and her empire, B. Cunliffe, page 49. One of the rules of the Roman brigands was that no man would be allowed to have more than one wife because of the limited number of women. They assumed this would be a factor in stopping any further wars or kidnapping. Brigham Young commented on this incident. Just ask yourselves, historians, when was monogamy introduced onto the face of the earth? When those buccaneers, who settled on the peninsula where Rome now stands, could not steal women enough to have 2 or 3 apiece, they passed a law that a man should have but one woman. And this started monogamy and the downfall of the plurality system. In the days of Jesus, Rome, having dominion over Jerusalem, they carried out the doctrine more or less. This was the rise, start and foundation of the doctrine of monogamy, and never till then was there a law passed, that we have any knowledge of, that a man should have but one wife. JD 12-261. The origin of the law of monogamy. The rape of the Sabine women by the Romans. Courtesy of Caesar's Palace, Las Vegas, Nevada. The city of Rome prospered greatly from their stealing, pillaging and conquering of other tribes and nations. Individuals and communities began to envy their power and wealth, and were willing to join in with them. One of the leaders of the Sabines, Attis Clausus, was so eager for a share of Rome's amenities that, with the agreement of its authorities and presumably of its Latin allies as well, he moved his whole clan of 4,000 or more relatives and supporters to Roman territory, where he settled them and became the founder of Rome's great Claudian clan, 505 BC. The History of Rome, Michael Grant, page 46. This may not be such a significant fact of history, other than it shows the influx of peoples that gradually assimilated themselves into and under the political and religious systems of the Romans, including monogamy. As Rome increased in size and power, the law of monogamy continued along with it, not as a religious law, but as a civil and governmental edict, and a very strict one at that. However, divorce was easy. In some cases all that was necessary was to say, I divorce thee, I divorce thee, I divorce thee, and it became official. Thus came the strict law of monogamy and the simple law of divorce. From the book History and Philosophy of Marriage, or Polygamy and Monogamy Compared, published in 1869 by the Rev. James Campbell, came a very interesting record of legal origins of monogamy. He, too, attributes this dating of the first roots of monogamy with the customs and laws of the Romans. In order to give some just conception of Roman monogamy at that time when it first came in contact with Christianity, and when it began to impose its social system upon the other nations of Europe, for these two events are quite synchronous, I will now, as briefly as possible, give some account of the domestic life and manners of the 6 imperial Caesars who governed Rome at that period. In this account I shall enumerate their many marriages and their numerous divorces and adoptions, and state their exact relationship to each other. By this means, I hope to be able to explain the complexity of Roman affinities, which has baffled the apprehension of so many acute and learned historians, and at the same time to exhibit the original nature and true spirit of Roman monogamy. See pages 84-86. Establishing this monogamy law, enforced by governmental powers, was in reality a civil wrong. Marriage was intended to be a religious rite, and government should have nothing to do with marriages and family life. The resulting easy divorce laws were another evil in that particular system. Other evils soon followed, as explained by Apostle Orson Pratt. Since old pagan Rome and Greece worshippers of idols passed a law confining man to one wife, there has been a great surplus of females who have had no possible chance of getting married. You may think this a strange statement, but it is a fact that those nations were the founders of what is termed monogamy. All other nations, with few exceptions, had followed the scriptural plan of having more wives than one. These nations, however, were very powerful, and when Christianity came to them, especially the Roman nation, it had to bow to their mandates and customs, hence the Christians gradually adopted the monogamic system. The consequence was that a great many marriageable ladies of those days, and of all generations from that time to the present, have not had the privilege of husbands, as the one-wife system has been established by law among the nations descended from the great Roman Empire, namely, the nations of modern Europe and the American states. This law of monogamy, or the monogamic system, laid the foundation for prostitution and the evils and diseases of the most revolting nature and character, under which modern Christendom groans, for as God has implanted, for a wise purpose, certain feelings in the breasts of females as well as the males, the gratification of which is necessary to health and happiness, and which can only be accomplished legitimately in the married state. Myriads of those who have been deprived of the privilege of entering that state, rather than be deprived of the gratification of those feelings altogether, have, in despair, given way to wickedness and licentiousness, hence the whoredoms and prostitution among the nations of the earth, where the mother of harlots has her seat. J.D. 13 194-95. Historian Henry Sheldon clearly saw the effects springing from the monogamic system of marriage in both the early and later years of the Roman Empire, including the same results with Christianity. He stated that the unmaking of marriages was about as common as their making. He gave examples of how common divorce became. C. Sulpicius divorced his wife because she had gone unveiled upon the street. Q. Antistius Vetus divorced his because she had spoken openly and familiarly to a freedwoman. P. Sempronius Sophus sent his away because she had gone to the play without his knowledge. Aemilius Paulus, the conqueror of Perseus, put away his wife without assigning any cause at all. And how was it among the contemporaries of Cicero? He himself separated from his first wife, in order to take a wealthier one, from his second, because she did not seem sufficiently afflicted over the death of his daughter. Cato, with all his moral strictness, divorced his first spouse Attilia, who had borne him 2 children, and delivered over his second wife Marcia, with the approval of her father, to his friend Hortensius, after whose death he married her again. Pompey put away his wife Antistia, in order to make family connection with Sylla, and took his stepdaughter Aemilia, who, however, had first to be separated from her husband Glabrio, by whom she was with child. After her death he took Mucia, whom he also divorced in order to marry Caesar's daughter, Julia. On their side, women separated themselves from their husbands without any cause, except their mere pleasure. In fine, it was not altogether hyperbole when Seneca spoke of noble women as reckoning their years by their successive husbands, rather than by the number of the consuls. History of the Christian Church, Henry Sheldon, 129-30. Brigham Young confirmed this as a wicked system. Those who are acquainted with the history of the world are not ignorant that polygamy has always been the general rule, and monogamy the exception. Since the founding of the Roman Empire, monogamy has prevailed more extensively than in times previous to that. The founders of that ancient empire were robbers and women stealers, and made laws favoring monogamy in consequence of the scarcity of women among them, and hence this monogamic system which now prevails throughout all Christendom, and which has been so fruitful a source of prostitution and whoredom throughout all the Christian monogamic cities of the Old and New World, until rottenness and decay are at the root of their institutions both national and religious. J.D. 11 127-28. One of the first evils that came from this Roman monogamy law was the surplus women resulting from all the Roman soldiers that were killed in battle. They would have little or no chance of getting married at all. This was the beginning of their problems, which resulted in such evils as prostitution, illegitimate children, and disease. Monogamy is only one of the present customs that Christians have held over from the Romans. Some of the ceremonies in marriage are identical, such as conferitio, literally, eating a cake together, which required religious ceremony and was confined to patricians. Story of Civilization Caesar and Christ, Will Durant, page 69. Also after the marriage the husband lifted her over the threshold, presented her with the keys of the house, and put his neck with hers under a yoke to signify their common bond. Ibid. Page 69. Another part of Roman tradition was when the man placed an iron ring upon the 4th finger of the girl's left hand, because it was believed that a nerve ran thence to the heart. Ibid. Page 68. See also Roman women, A. Britain, pages 135-36. Not only did such marriage customs become a part of Christianity, but so did their legal, political and religious systems. In his usual clear, pointed, and definitive language, Brigham Young made a simple summary of the monogamic system. Monogamy, or restrictions by law to one wife, is no part of the economy of heaven among men. Such a system was commenced by the founders of the Roman Empire. That empire was founded on the banks of the Tiber by wandering brigands. When these robbers founded the city of Rome, it was evident to them that their success in attaining a balance of power with their neighbors depended upon introducing females into their body politic, so they stole them from the Sabines, who were near neighbors. The scarcity of women gave existence to laws restricting one wife to one man. Rome became the mistress of the world and introduced this order of monogamy wherever her sway was acknowledged. Thus this monogamic order of marriage, so esteemed by modern Christians as a holy sacrament and divine institution, is nothing but a system established by a set of robbers. JD 9:322. Chapter 4. The Africans. A variety of polygamy cultures. Africa has proved to be one of the most interesting nations allowing and practicing polygamy. Some may wonder why so many backward or heathen people should be included in a study or defense of the practice of plural marriage. One of the reasons is because Africa is composed of so many different cultures and tribes living plural marriage, and yet they have little or no contact with each other. And interestingly, from out of the backwood jungles or in the most refined, advanced metropolitan cities, the effects of plural marriage are about the same. Father Eugene Hillman spent 25 years in Africa, where he worked with various natives, especially the black people of the backwoods. He found a people that had never seen indoor plumbing, electric lights, telephones or television, but they were polygamists. In that society they had never heard of a woman selling her body in prostitution. It was inconceivable to them. There was no excuse, for every woman could be married to the man she wanted. Yet if they should come to America and see our modern monogamist Christian nation, they would see resulting prostitution, illegitimate children, abortions and sexually transmitted diseases. Why is it that intellectual Americans can learn such a profound moral lesson from so-called heathens? Map of Africa. East Africa, West Africa, South Africa. Sudan, Mauritania, Angola. Ethiopia, Gambia, Southwest Africa. Somalia, Guinea, South Africa. Kenya, Liberia, Zimbabwe. Tanzania, Cameroon, Botswana. Uganda, Ivory Coast, Mozambique. Ghana, Nambia. Volta. Mali. Nigeria. Gabon. North Africa, Central Africa. Egypt, Chad. Morocco, Saint. Afr. Rep. Algeria, Congo. Western Sahara, Zaire. Libya, Niger. In Nigeria there is an infiltrating movement of the Western influence which is causing significant social change. Western monogamy has created an increase in prostitution, adultery, concubinage and disease. Many of the tribes do not even have in their language a word for prostitution, but this institution has developed among them side by side with Christianity. Polygamy Reconsidered, Eugene Hillman, page 124. Many African tribes have the custom that there should be sexual abstinence during a wife's pregnancy and lactation. However, after monogamy was introduced, there was a tendency for the husband to seek out a prostitute, temporary concubine, or the wife of some other man during those particular times. Polygamy in Africa means that a man has more than one wife at the same time, but in America, it has sometimes been interpreted as a man marrying and divorcing several women. There is a deep-seated sociological and moral difference. In some nations, plural marriage is simply an improved cultural system. In another, it may have begun as an historical and religious custom. Then again, it may be based on a specific revelation from God. Regardless, it should be investigated by the fruits that result from both polygamy and monogamy. Africa is one of those places where it can be advantageously studied. Most monogamists never really have the opportunity to become acquainted with some of the intricate events that can crowd into the family in thinking of polygamists. Eugene Hillman grasped a part of these when he wrote about some of the Africans. Where it is believed and seen and felt that polygamous, much more than monogamous, families produce for their members greater security, prosperity, and prestige, the women themselves will be seen to favor the custom of plural marriage. Since the wives, together with their children, share in all the benefits of belonging to the polygamous family, they themselves will sometimes pressure their husbands into seeking additional wives. Some women even regard it as a disgrace to be the only wife of a man. Among the Kaka people of Cameroon, a wife may provoke her husband to take another wife by ridiculing him and calling him a poor man. Women have, of course, many other ways of exerting pressure on their husbands. Polygamy Reconsidered, Hillman, page 120. Most people seldom consider how important and beneficial this principle can be for the women, because it is presumed that the men are the only benefactors. In monogamy, the men usually look for the beautiful or shapely woman, but a polygamous man wants a woman who can help him and the family with her knowledge, talent, ability to work, cooperative personality, and good spirit. This opens the door of marriage to many women who otherwise may not be able to get married. In societies where every woman is expected or required to be married, the system of polygyny provides a proper place also for women whose defects, blind, deaf, spastic, epileptic, lame, retarded, would otherwise make it impossible for them to find husbands, and thus a place in a family and in society. In monogamous societies, such handicapped women may perhaps constitute the bulk of those who never marry. No one, according to Hagnall, seems to have discussed this problem. Transition in African Beliefs, Ralph Tanner, page 95. Even women who cannot bear any children themselves are able to share in the love and care of a growing family. Customs and traditions differ somewhat among the African tribes. According to John Gunther, most tribes in East Africa are polygamous, without limit to the number of wives a man may have. Reasons for polygamy are both economic and in the realm of symbolism and superstition. Many Africans think that sexual prowess and in particular the ability to procreate children have an association with fertility of the soil. A person's worth is not measured by the criterion of wealth in much of Black Africa, but by fecundity. But women are, on the whole, freer than in Muslim society. This does not mean that they necessarily have a good life. Fathers or husbands can be tyrants anywhere. But, generally speaking, a young Bantu girl is not packaged up and delivered to the groom sight unseen by her parents to become an ornament in a stranger's harem. She herself can associate with young men and know the joys of courtship and even have a say in the choice of a husband. She can refuse an undesired suitor and is seldom, at least in advanced tribes like the Chagas, married against her will. In many tribes a bride is supposed to be a virgin, and promiscuity and infidelity are frowned upon. Inside Africa, John Gunther, page 296. One of the tribes that does not live plural marriage is the Pygmies, as observed by the same author. Pygmies are monogamous. It was difficult to tell women from men. The children had swollen bellies, with their navels bulging out almost in the shape of small pears. Pygmies in the Congo and Rwanda-Urundi are forest people who seldom see the sun, grow no crops, do no work, and live on the game they spear or trap. They have no villages of their own. They are predominantly meat-eaters, but not cannibals. Pygmies are generally despised by other Africans. A black servant will say to his master, "There are 4 men outside, and 2 pygmies." Nobody knows surely the origin of the pygmies, who must be among the ugliest people in the world. Inside Africa, Gunther, page 684. In speaking of one pygmy woman, Gunther said she might have been 14 or 40. Ibid. Page 684. The Pygmy tribe is one of the 22% of the African groups that does not accept polygamy. From this total of 742 clearly identified socio-cultural units, it was found that in 580 of them polygamy is accepted as a preferential form of marriage. In other words, polygamy is traditionally and socially normative in 78% of these anthropological groups, although the incidence is not the same in all of them. Polygamy Reconsidered, Hillman, page 94. John Gunther also observed and reported numbers of polygamous people in specific areas of Africa. Rwanda and Urundi are separate units historically, but are administered together. Each has about 2 million people on roughly 10,000 square miles. 8% of the people are still polygamous. There are only 5,406 Europeans in all. Inside Africa, Gunther, page 685. Population percentages in Guinea show a ratio of 122 females for every 100 males. In Tanzania the male ratio is 95 to every 100 females, while in the Kilimanjaro region, there are a surplus of over 17,000 females. These ratios are not confined to African regions, but are similar all over the world. Insurance companies' statistics show that the mortality rate of infants is much higher in males than females. Later the males suffer losses through wars, occupational hazards, and usually die at earlier age than do women. In the sub-Saharan Africa there are about 150 females for every 100 men. If modern Christianity enforced their monogamous rule on these people, it would produce absolute chaos. It is apparent, however, that the natives will hold on to their polygamous culture, in spite of these modern family busters who come in the name of Christianity. As one African writer stated, the practice of polygamy is at present the rule in Africa. Women have not only reconciled themselves to their position, some even consider it a disgrace to be the only wife of a man. They give all sorts of reasons for desiring a partner or co-wife, and sometimes help their husbands to prepare for the necessary expenses of having another wife. As long as this idea remains, polygamy will no doubt remain. Polygamy in the Church in Africa, S. I. Kale, pages 222 to 23. In the Badam tribe there are very few illegitimate children because they encourage the young women to marry early. They soon learn that it is wise while young males are roaming around. There, as here in America, most young males have a tendency to postpone marriage. The Christian missionary system in Africa began to assume a more tolerant attitude after realizing the sorrow and problems inflicted upon their converts. To make polygamists divorce, break up families, throw wives into celibacy, widowhood, poverty, disgrace and prostitution had to be un-Christian. It could even be classed as one of the sins committed by the clergy which Jesus condemned as heavy burdens and grievous to be borne. But they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. Matt 23:4. Instead of helping to strengthen families, they were helping to destroy them. Occasionally opposing positions were taken by the same church. For instance, in the Anglican Church, West African polygamists could be baptized, but in South Africa they could not. The Anglican Bishop of Malawi wrote, "I came to this diocese from a country where Christianity had been planted largely by the Christian wives of polygamous husbands, and their courage and resourcefulness in living a Christian life and bringing up their children as practicing members of the church won my admiration. It was with profound shock that I learned that here none of them would have been admitted to holy baptism, not because of any fault of their own, but because they had the misfortune to be brought up in a society where polygamy was the rule. After discussion with the clergy, changes are coming, and baptism will no longer be refused to a woman who is married to a polygamist before her baptism." Marriage and Baptism Regulations, R.M.C. Jeffery, quoting Bishop of Nyasaland, page 5. Several other Protestant churches have begun to liberalize their views toward polygamists. The Lutheran Church in Liberia believed it was good policy to admit polygamists into full membership in their church. A Methodist bishop who had considerable experience with both sides of the issue made a statement that shows a clear insight into the problem. Is it more Christian to have organized prostitution, marital infidelity with impunity, a rapidly growing divorce rate, and increasing numbers of illegitimate children than polygamy? Is it more Christian for young women to become prostitutes, call girls, or mistresses than to become the second or third wife of a respected member of the community? Is permitting youth to choose their own mates necessarily more Christian than an agreement between families? Is a widow any better or happier in the world alone than living intimately with a member of her husband's family? The Unpopular Missionary, Ralph Dodge, page 145. Many practical benefits of living a polygamous lifestyle in Africa are similar to those in any other country. When a family is made up of several wives with their households, it means that in time of need there will always be someone around to help. This is corporate existence. For example, when one wife gives birth, there are other wives to nurse her and care for her children during the time she is regaining her vitality. If one wife dies, there are others to take over the care of her children. In case of sickness, other wives will fetch water from the river, cut firewood, cook and do other jobs for the family. If one wife is barren, others bear children for the family, so that the torch of life is not extinguished. Where peasant farming is the means of livelihood, the many children in a polygamous family are an economic asset even if they also must eat plenty of food. African Religions and Philosophy, John Beatty, pages 142-43. The children raised in a polygamous family have definite advantages as well. Eugene Hillman noted. As for the children of these families with several mothers, there is no evidence at all to suggest that their psychological development is adversely affected in any way. Each child has his own normal emotional attachment to his own mother by birth or by adoption, and co-wives are normally very solicitous and affectionate toward all the children of their husband. The husband himself, according to the traditional norms of his society, is fully dedicated to the good of his children, who are regarded as the greatest of his achievements and the joy of his life. It might even be said, at least as a tentative hypothesis, that the children of polygamous households, all other things being equal, will generally tend to be both physically and psychologically healthier than the children of monogamous families, insofar as the latter enjoy less security and less prestige. At any rate, in terms of their own social ideals and cultural values, the advantages are with the children of polygamous households. Polygamy Reconsidered, Hillman, page 126. It is very interesting to note that the polygamous families of Aborigine tribes in the jungles of Africa have many similar characteristics to Mormon polygamous families. Compare some of Dr. Hillman's observations and statements about the African culture. Each new relationship gives a greater cohesion to the aggregates of social units that make up the tribe or people or nation. In such a society, each member is to many others in some degree a brother or sister or mother or father, son or daughter, for each one belongs to the same ethnic cultural family, often with the same legendary common ancestors. The deep sense of solidarity, which may even be traced back mythologically to common parents in the beginning, imposes the duty to continue each family through offspring. This vital continuity of past and future generations is concretely symbolized in the special relationships and the titles used between grandparents and grandchildren. Among the Bantu-speaking peoples there is a strong bond between the living and the dead. A person lives on after death, somehow through, or in relation to, his progeny. This belief has profound significance in relation to the practice of polygyny. Procreation is the link with afterlife and overcomes absolute death. Hence, the fear that a man might die without a surviving male child is one of the factors behind the practice of polygamy. As the alliances multiply relationships, the sense of security expands and deepens in the polygamous household. In a society that stresses the importance of large families, a woman naturally sees her own personal self-fulfillment through childbearing, and the mother of several children is greatly respected by her relatives and neighbors. The sharp edge of this suffering may be dulled through her active participation in the larger family life of the polygamous household. Children are the glory of marriage, and the more there are of them, the greater the glory. Taken from Polygamy Reconsidered, Hillman, pages 114 to 120. And these teachings and customs are also similar to those of Israel. Among some peoples, the Nuer and Zulu for example, the brother is required by customary law to cohabit with the widow in order to raise children, which will be counted not as his, but as the children of the deceased. The more favorable solution to the problem of an infertile wife is simultaneous polygamy. Loneliness is not an indigenous African problem. Ibid. Pages 121 to 22. Romantic love does not play as important a role in African plural marriages as vividly portrayed in Hollywood movies or passionate novels. Romantic love, a dominant feature in the current Western conception of marriage, is not very notable, or at least it is rarely dramatized in traditional polygynous societies. The African, according to Radcliffe Brown, does not think of marriage as a union based on romantic love, although beauty as well as character and health are sought in the choice of a wife. Meaningful interpersonal relationships, however, are not lacking in polygamous households. Radcliffe Brown continues. The strong affection that normally exists after some years of successful marriage is the product of the marriage itself, conceived as a process resulting from living together and cooperating in many activities, and particularly in the rearing of children. Such relationships of friendship and affection are not by their very nature exclusive, and they exist even between co-wives. There is, nevertheless, a great burden on the husband of plural wives. He must discipline himself to an equitable distribution of his love, which is a service to his whole family, not an exclusive affair of personal gratification between two individuals. If interpersonal relationships, and especially the manifestations of conjugal affection, seem to be less intense in polygamous families than in monogamous families, this may be because they are more extensive. Ibid. Page 125. This author had an extensive phone interview with Dr. Eugene Hillman, author of Polygamy Reconsidered and a professor in a Minnesota university. After his 25-year study of African polygamy and monogamy, he is one of the strongest advocates of re-establishing polygamy as an acceptable alternative in Christian nations. It may seem strange that a renowned Catholic priest would recommend plural marriage for a community, society, or nation. However, he saw polygamy firsthand and observed the favorable results, especially in comparison to societies without it. This same conclusion applies to every other nation and society referred to in this study. Africa has been a wealthy nation, and it surely must be noted that its polygamous tribes have provided a wealth of information for Christian nations. However, rather than learning valuable lessons in morality, they have instead pushed their monogamous system with its evils on them. Gunther noted that, since 1952, however, by terms of a new Belgian law aiming to reduce polygamy, only the first wife is considered to be legitimate. Inside Africa, Gunther, page 680, as monogamy is increasingly promoted among the Africans, the attending problems will also increase. If polygamy is considered as one of the relics of barbarism, maybe we'll have to adopt some of these old relics into our society before we destroy ourselves with our old monogamous relics. Of all the evil attending the monogamous Christian nations, it may be better to adopt the social polygamous laws of the jungle, so we could improve our modern society. In many ways our present society is worse than that of these backward nations. Maybe our modern Christian society should no longer look upon the savage or uncivilized societies as barbaric or backward in all areas. Our whole society has the appearance of vulgarity, and our morals and standards are less Christ-like than many of those so-called uncivilized nations. We have progressed to the point of being able to destroy each other rather than learning the ways to save ourselves from ourselves. To advance in scientific excellence at the expense of forfeiting our standards of morality will someday bring us disaster. We may say with Pogo, we have seen the enemy and they are us. Chapter 5. The Hindus. India law changed polygamy to monogamy. Hinduism is the professed religion of over 2/3 of the people in India. It embraces the philosophies and moral teachings of sacred works in the Vedas, 4 ancient sacred books of Hinduism, consisting of psalms, chants, sacred formulas, etc., and contains some of the most beautiful and uplifting thoughts embraced by any religion. Map of India. Webster defines Hinduism as the religion and social system of the Hindus, developed from Brahmanism with elements from Buddhism, Jainism, etc., added. Webster's New World Dic. 1984, page 664. The history of this religion is difficult to trace. Even the authors of most of its sacred writings are unknown. Their teachings have attracted students of religion from all over the world and have had more impact on Christianity than Christianity has had on them. The morality of their teachings is of the highest standard, and their devotees are very dedicated. Interestingly, their faith and culture include the practice of plural marriage. Plural marriages in India have been a part of their culture for thousands of years. However, that custom was changed about 40 years ago, providing an excellent opportunity to study the positive and negative effects of both monogamy and polygamy in the same culture with the same people. The right to live plural marriage in India has been replaced by a law enforcing monogamy not by the will of the people, but by the government. In 1955, the Parliament of India established the Hindu Marriage Act, which abolished plural marriages in that country. A study was made in which it was discovered that there was a ratio of 5 brides for every 4 bridegrooms. Recognizing this problem, a Hindu by the name of Atul Krishna Kundu wrote an appeal for a revision of the statutes to reinstate plural marriage. Imposition of the rule of monogamy by means of Hindu Marriage Act 1955 on Hindus of India added fuel to the fire of various socio-economic problems of the Hindu community, because this imposition of the rule of monogamy on Hindus of India against Hindu religion, the very religion by which they are identified, is not at all a true representation of the will of the community. Polygamy and the Hindu, Kundu, p. 8. Atul then followed with comments and a chart showing the general trend of surplus women in the country. But actually the brides have been much more in excess compared to bridegrooms, for the reasons arising out of the fundamental difference between a man and a woman already mentioned earlier. That is why practically we see that if a bridegroom 40 years old wants to marry a bride 20 years younger than him, he can definitely have a bride as his wife, because those brides due to poverty for the purpose of solving their problem of feeding, clothing, and lodging, even prefer to be a co-wife to prostitution. Bureau of Corrective Administration under Home Ministry is not at all sufficient to correct and prevent the poor and unfortunate women from being prostitutes or so, depriving them of their natural desire to become mothers of legitimate children. In fact, the percentage of bridegrooms and brides of Hindu Bengali community according to those registered in Tathikendra, Calcutta, the Organization for Marriage Contacts, are as follows. Percentage of bridegrooms brides excess brides. December 1971 36% 64% 78%. December 1972 39 61 57. December 1973 41 59 44. December 1974 39 61 57. December 1975 39 61 57. December 1976 41 59 44. According to the method of sampling, the above data can be taken as the reflection of the middle class of the people, or any class of people, of Hindu Bengali community of India, where the social environment is different from that of Western countries. It seems that due to lack of scientific understanding of the society we live in, monogamy was imposed on the Hindu community of India against the directives of Hindu religion, the religion by which they are identified. IBID. Pages 10 to 11. The India government, the same as in other countries, likes to control the affairs of religion and regulate how people live and believe, usually resulting in suppression and catastrophe. Atul was making an appeal that the time has come for us to review the administrative system of India, so that the control of the parliament should be withdrawn from all institutions pertaining to all religions. IBID. Page 12. He was asking them to find some solution for excess young women. He wanted the law to be repealed, so their culture could return to the natural flow and interest of the society. He continued. Therefore, time has come for us to review the imposition of monogamy by Hindu Marriage Act, 1955, on Hindu community of India, because this is necessary for stopping the socio-economic deterioration, as well as for the advancement of Hindu community of India. After the implementation of monogamy for Hindus, criminal offences among women have increased, suicides, mainly among males, the normal breadwinners for Hindu families, illegitimate children have increased in number. Unhappy families and others through prostitutes spread venereal diseases in Bombay, so much that Bombay is now one of the 10 cities in the world where the incidence of VD is highest. Venereal diseases in Calcutta also have grown tremendously high. Mental illness of people due to family feuds, sexual maladjustment and marital disharmony have increased. Murders of housewives have increased. Some husbands have been killed by or at the conspiracy of their wives. Ibid. Pages 14 to 15. Picture the wives of Krishna pleading for mercy on the dragon. This sounds very similar to a description of the American Christian system of monogamy. In judging a general practice by their fruits, monogamy has certainly failed miserably. Generally speaking, it does not work for the Christians nor the heathens. Attell hit the mark again when he declared, if monogamy is to be imposed at all, it must be imposed only on contractual marriages, which are nothing but legal contracts between the bridegroom and the bride, spelling out rights and obligations on everything, e.g., conjugal right, shared marriage presentations, shared housework, planned number of reproduction of children, custody of children, ownership of properties achieved by joint effort, the terms and conditions of divorce, if any, etc., but it should not have been imposed on marriages by customary rites, according to Hindu religion. Ibid. Page 16. Exactly. If a couple wishes to have the state enter into their marriage with whatever desired stipulations they want in a legalized contractual agreement, then it is the privilege of the state to do so. If, on the other hand, the couple desires to enter into a religious ceremony, complying with the rules, regulations and commandments of their sacred books and scriptures, then the state should have no right to interfere. Such is a good example of separation between church and state. This report raises an interesting question. If the government imposes a law against a correct religious principle, how can it be legal? The Hindus consider the monogamous government-inspired laws as a marriage arranged, negotiated and settled by persons other than the bridegroom and the bride. Page 17, and as such, the bridegroom and bride are married by misrepresentation, which may be a source of conflict after marriage. Atul Kundu writes, it is clear that the imposition of the rule of monogamy on the Hindu community of India in 1955 was done without any systems analysis, i.e., without studying the problems of the people of India in totality. He then makes a comparison of India with America. Similarly, a single basic fault in the legal system of the Hindu community of India is sufficient to collapse the Hindu community of India slowly and gradually if that basic fault is not discontinued. Indian philosophy and culture are splendid and much more advanced than those of the West. But we, the Indians, have grown an inferiority complex in us looking at the advancement of the West in technology and blindly copied the rule of monogamy in 1955 for Hindus of India, forgetting our rich culture and philosophy. Ibid. Page 21. Thus, monogamy has become a serious detriment to the Hindu culture, which has been that marriage should be a family matter rather than a government contract between a bridegroom and a bride. Furthermore, it is religious law that the man should rule over the woman, not have equal authority in their marriage. Once again, according to Atul, 2 prime ministers in India or 2 presidents in USA having equal authority would have been detrimental to the administration of the states, and in the same way the husband and the wife having equal authority in a family are likely to be harmful to the smooth running and progress of the family. In USA, a country of monogamy, at least 1/3 of the total marriages are ending in divorce in a year, and it is likely to increase in the future. In Britain, another land of monogamy, divorce rate is now among the highest in the world. There is 1 divorce approximately for every 2 marriages. Ibid. Page 22. Christian Americans can and should learn a great deal from these heathen infidels. The recent results of enforcing monogamy in India should show that it is destroying them and is doing the same thing here in America. If we fail to check that system, it will do as Atul said, collapse the community. Slowly and gradually if that basic fault is not discontinued. Ibid. Page 21. To summarize the philosophy of Atul Kundu and the Hindu people, consider the following points. 1. There is a nationwide problem because of the surplus of women. 2. Polygamy would allow more women to marry and would help them with their financial difficulties, providing needed food, clothing and lodging. 3. It would help solve the problems of so much prostitution and illegitimacy. 4. The government would have to regulate and enforce one less law and would not be able to interfere with the practice of religion. 5. It would avoid state contracts which include many provisions that neither the bride nor groom want. 6. Polygamy would help stop the social and economic deterioration that has been growing in the society. 7. It would diminish criminal activities between husband and wife and allow the husband to be the head of the family. 8. It would decrease suicides, murder, venereal diseases, mental illness and sexual maladjustments. The similarities in the conditions of both India and America are evident. Removing the government from the control of marriages, unless invited by the parties concerned, and placing such unions back in the realm of religion, would enable polygamy or monogamy to be the respective choices of the individuals involved, and would undoubtedly improve the standards and conditions of community life. The standard of morality in America is among the worst of all the nations of the earth, yet America is supposed to be a Christian nation. What has happened to the principles they say are the most wholesome of any other religion or nation? There must be something amiss if greater problems are being created here than those in the heathen nations. Chapter 6. The Islams. The polygamous solution in Arabia. By definition, Islam means the Muslim religion, a monotheistic religion in which the supreme deity is Allah and the chief prophet and founder is Muhammad. Webster's New World Dic. 1984 ed. Page 747. Muhammad was born in Arabia and lived from 570 to 632 BC. Most Muslims feel, however, that the beginnings of their religion actually went back further than that. They claim it is the restoration of the original religion of Abraham. The terms Islam, Muslim, and Mohammedan are used somewhat interchangeably. Map of Arabia. Islam means submission to the will of God, also submission to their prophet, Muhammad, and to the Quran, Quran. The Muslims consider the Quran as containing the very words of God himself, and they are extremely careful to preserve its content. There is probably no other book in history, including the Bible, that has been so much studied or commented upon as the Quran, states the Encyclopedia Americana, 1995 ed. 15494. So it is most interesting that within this Mohammedan Bible that these people hold so sacred are instructions for living plural marriage, i.e. sample from Quran. The translation of this verse reads, "If you fear that you shall not be able to deal justly with the orphans, marry women of your choice, 2, or 3, or 4, but if you fear that you shall not be able to deal justly with them, then marry only one." Quran 4:3. And later from the same book. "And they ask for your instructions concerning women. Say, God does instruct you about them. And remember what has been rehearsed to you in the book concerning the orphan women to whom you give not the portions prescribed, and yet whom you desire to marry. As also concerning the children who are weak and depressed. That you stand firm for justice to orphans. There is not a good deed you do, but Allah is well aware of it." Holy Quran 4:127. Aladdin Shahbaz explains this verse by saying, "Orphans does not merely mean those who have lost their parents. In Quranic terminology, it means those who have lost shelter, protection, etc., those deprived by death of one spouse, the impoverished, etc. Polygamy, a remedy or a rite in al-Islam, Shahbaz, page 10. When Muhammad was 25, he married Khadijah, 15 years his senior, and for the next 25 years he was not inclined to a plural marriage, even though he had been offered beautiful women and riches by the Meccans to desist from his missionary activities. His small band went into 5 battles during and after which he saw the devastation to families resulting from war. It was after the Battle of Uhud that the men were allowed to take plural wives, solely for a remedy to the sorrowful plight of widows and their family. The revelation on polygamy was revealed after the Battle of Uhud, in which many Muslims were killed, leaving widows and orphans for whom due care was incumbent upon the Muslim survivors. Islam in Focus, Abd al-Hadi Hamuda, page 103. In such situations, polygamy is more of a solution to a serious problem than an exploitation of women by sensual men. Fida Hussein wrote that monogamy is the food which sustains society, polygamy is the medicine of the disease of a monogamous society. Wives of the Prophet, Hussein, page 71, and Shahbaz makes this interesting observation. It is obvious that if a man married in such an abnormal situation, e.g. the situation created by the consequences of the Battle of Uhud, etc., it will be a service to the nation, both on his part and the part of his first wife. A good Muslim sister, who is married, would consider it her duty to provide shelter to one of her unfortunate sisters, who has been driven to such a pitiable condition through no fault of her own. Polygamy. A remedy or a right, Shabazz, page 15. In earlier times many Arabs, including those who became Muslims, took great numbers of wives and treated them very badly. Then came a restriction upon the number of wives permitted, probably to make the men appreciate their wives more. Fida Hussein said, after the restrictive injunction, the Muslims retained 4 wives and discarded the surplus for better protection and their rights. Wives of the Prophet, page 69, there was a recognition of certain wrongs in the living of polygamy, but there were greater wrongs in the system of monogamy. Some of the purposes for plural marriage are more clearly seen among the heathen nations than among those that claim to be so enlightened. Many of the Islamic people show more genuine consideration and respect for women than do those in our own American Christian nation. Aladdin Shabazz wrote, "The study of Islamic history reveals that polygamy came into existence simply to save the women from destruction. Prophet Muhammad's marriages were motivated by a de facto humanitarian spirit, not sensual motive. His marriages to some show the policy of conciliating the hands of rival factions, etc., etc. Unmarried females unprovided for, widowed women generally with children, destituted females, in general, etc., engendered a delicate situation for Prophet Muhammad and other concerned Muslims. The problem was more than economics. They should be protected and their other human needs looked after and fulfilled. It is the duty of society to handle this delicate situation, protecting the individual dignity of those affected, as well as the moral fabric of the society. In light of these facts, it is suggested ambiguously in the Quran a feasible alternative by relaxing the rule of monogamy. Polygamy. A remedy or a right, Shabazz, pages 14 to 15. The Islamic and other religious societies have found that in various tribes and cultures, polygamy becomes a social and economic necessity, and many of these women not only accept polygamy, but even prefer it. During the first 7 centuries AD, the Persians continued to be better gentlemen than the Greeks, and prostitution was less frequent among them than among the Greeks. Rabbi Gamaliel praised the Persians especially for 2 qualities. They are temperate in eating, modest in the privy and in marital relations. Polygamy was also allowed and was recommended in cases where the first wife proved barren. Persian women were exceptionally beautiful. And it is the women who yearn and take the initiative in courtship and seduction. Feminine charms overcame masculine laws. Story of Civilization, Durant, 4:137. The girls often wed between the ages of 12 and 14, and the boys as early as 15. The groom was rarely allowed to see the face of his bride before marriage, and the wedding never required a priest. Polygamy among the Islams was usually confined to the rich, and concubines were permitted. Polygamous women were mostly content because of their offspring. Their family was a large blending of women and children. Dr. Jamal A. Badawi describes the meaning of plural marriage as outlined in Islam's law. The requirement of justice rules out the fantasy that man can own as many as he pleases. It also rules out the concept of secondary wife, for all wives have exactly the same status and are entitled to identical rights and claims over their husband. It also implies, according to the Islamic law, that should the husband fail to provide enough support for any of his wives, she can go to the court and ask for a divorce. The verse says marry not, kidnap, buy, or seduce. What is marriage as understood in Islam? Marriage in Islam is a civil contract which is not valid unless both contracting parties consent to it. Thus no wife can be forced or given to a husband who is already married. It is thus a free choice of both parties. As to the first wife, A. She may be barren or ill and see in polygamy a better solution than divorce. B. She may divorce him, unilaterally, if he is married to his second wife, provided that the nuptial contract gives her the right of unilateral divorce, isma. C. She can go to court and ask for a divorce if there is evidence of mistreatment or injustice inflicted upon her. Polygamy in Islamic law, Badawi, pages 6 to 7. The Muslim male was allowed to marry a Jewish or Christian woman, but not an idolatress. Muhammad accepted polygamy to better balance the community because of the high male mortality rate during wartime. It was an obligation for a man to have children, and each man could have 4 wives, but Muhammad himself was allowed to exceed that rule. Divorce was much less difficult for the woman than the man to attain, according to the Quran or the Talmud. It was written that the wife should recognize the authority of the male and she must obey her husband. Every woman who deeth, and her husband is pleased with her, shall enter paradise. Quran 4:35. Muhammad sometimes quarreled with his wives, but he was usually very pleased and spoke highly of them. He once said the most valuable thing in the world is a virtuous woman, also that men should be reminded that their mothers carried them with pain, brought them forth with pain, and nursed them for months, which is one of the reasons he felt that paradise is at the foot of the mothers. Muhammad claimed to have a revelation in which he saw paradise, where blessed males would have many wives. The historian, Will Durant, obtained a copy of this manifestation. It is one vast garden, watered with pleasant rivers and shaded with spreading trees. The blessed there will be dressed in silk brocades, and be adorned with gems. They will recline on couches, be served by handsome youths, and eat fruit from trees bowing down to fill their hands. By the mercy of Allah, there will be no speeches at these heavenly banquets. Instead there will be virgins never yet touched by man or jinn, in beauty like the jacinth and coral stone, with swelling bosoms but modest gaze, with eyes as fair and pure as sheltered eggs, and bodies free from the imperfections and indignities of mortal flesh. Each blessed male will have 72 of these for his reward, and neither age nor weariness nor death shall mar the loveliness of these maidens, or their comrades' bliss. Since pious and believing women will also enter paradise, some confusion might result, but such difficulties would not be insuperable to men accustomed to polygamy. And round about them shall go children, never growing old. The Story of Civilization, Durant, 4:179. Durant then added, who could reject such a revelation? The law of Islam was further clarified by Dr. Jamal A. Badawi. It is now evident that the association of polygamy with Islam is not only unfair or biased, but based on serious misunderstanding. Polygamy was practiced, often without limitations, in almost all cultures. It was sanctioned by various religions, and practiced both before Islam and for many centuries thereafter. It is both honest and accurate to say that it is Islam which regulated this practice, limited it, made it more humane, and instituted equal rights and status for all wives. What the Quranic decrees amount to, taken together, is a discouragement of polygamy, unless necessity for it exists. It is also evident that the general rule in Islam is monogamy and not polygamy. However, permission to practice limited polygamy is only consistent with Islam's realistic view of the nature of man and woman, and of the various social needs, problems, and cultural variations. The question is, however, far more than the inherent flexibility of Islam, it also is the frank and straightforward approach of Islam in dealing with practical problems. Rather than requiring hypocritical and superficial compliance, Islam delves deeper into the problems of individuals and societies, and provides for legitimate and clean solutions, which are far more beneficial than would be the case if they were ignored. There is no doubt that the second wife legally married and treated kindly is better off than a mistress without any legal rights or security. This vitality, flexibility, and foresightedness of the teachings of Islam cannot possibly be attributed to any man or group of men, including Prophet Muhammad, p. himself. Its secret simply lies in its divine source, God Most High, who knows in entirety what human needs and problems are. Polygamy in Islamic Law, Badawi, pages 10-11. The Quran itemizes a set of marriage conditions or rules for the purpose of making a righteous union between a couple. 1. Prohibitions to marriage. These are nearly the same as in the Old Testament: mothers, daughters, sisters, etc. 2. Deal justly with all wives. There are different stipulations between permanent and temporary contracts, which may be similar to wives and concubines. 3. Mutual love and compassion in the union. These include peace, tranquility, and sharing sorrows and joys with each other. Shacking up does not embrace these. 4. Multiplication of the human race. Both are responsible for this divine object of bearing children and their welfare. 5. Children have the right to inherit properties of deceased parents and relatives. Thus children should be the rightful heir of inheritance. These rules are similar to those in the Mosaic Code, and are reasonable enough to promote a good marriage in or out of plural marriage. And from another source, Islam permits him 4 legal wives on earth, which Christianity has not yet got around to doing. Islam gains strongly by reason of the rivalry between various Christian sects. Pagans see the spectacle of Protestant and Catholic missionaries competing in the same area, and do not understand how this harmonizes with the principle of a universal Christian God. Inside Africa, John Gunther, page 64. The anti-polygamy governments in some Islam areas have put a great deal of pressure on the Muslims through their Christian laws. Until today the practice is highly discouraged in many Muslim nations. Polygyny is still prevalent in some Muslim nations. The Quran, the Bible of Islam, officially permits the Muslim man to take 4 wives. Although polygamy has been practiced widely throughout Islam, Western mores have had their effect on Muslim society, and many Muslims consider plural marriages a sign of cultural backwardness. Consequently, polygyny is now banned or at least discouraged in several Muslim nations. Encyclopedia Americana, 1995 ed. 22 365. Most of the modern Christian nations are not interested in solving the problems of surplus women by restoring plural marriage. They are more concerned about gaining converts from each other and subjecting them to their priestcrafts. They are more interested in power and money than in the miseries of widows and unmarried women. Dr. Jamal A. Badawi observed. Both unmarried women and widows are human beings with needs. Unless their instinctive needs are legitimately satisfied, the temptation is great for corruption and immorality. Polygamy in Islamic Law, Badawi, page 5. The percentage of polygamists in Arabia and other countries is usually quite small, as there are only so many surplus women, and there aren't too many men who want to take on that additional responsibility. Jihan Sadat wrote. All over the Arab world, the taking of multiple wives was the exception rather than the rule. In Egypt, polygamy was practiced by only 3% of the population. In Tunisia, polygamy has been banned since 1963. A Woman of Egypt, Sadat, page 28. How strange that when there are only 3% of the population living plural marriage, they must make laws against such a small minority. It is evident that both Talmudic and Mohammedan laws were mostly man-made, as many statements were quite humorous, and God could not have originated them. They blamed Eve for her intelligent curiosity, but gave her credit for an instinctive wisdom missing in man. They said that when 10 measures of speech were given to the world, women took 9, the men 1. They requested that woman beautify herself for her husband rather than for other men. Also, a woman's place was in the home, but their earnings and property belonged to the husband. It seemed that gossip was common, and one rabbi said, 100 women are equal to only 1 witness. The value of a good woman was that no man is so rich as a wife noted for her good deeds, and all the blessings of a household come through the wife. On the other hand, it was said that a man who has a bad wife will never see the face of hell. However, let men beware of causing women to weep. God counts their tears. See the story of civilization, Will Durant, 4 363. Islamic teachings forbid illicit sexual relations, which is punishable by severe measures, even capital punishment on occasion, so they have reduced modern Christian corruptions of sexual sin from their society. Furthermore, the people's free choice between monogamy and polygamy has solved some of these problems. To sum up, Islam being against immorality, hypocritical pretense of morality, and against divorce unless no better solution is available, provides for a better alternative which is consistent with human nature and with the preservation of pure and legitimate sex relationships. In a situation like this, it is doubtful that any solution would be better than polygamy, which is, after all, an optional solution. Polygamy in Islamic Law, Badawi, page 8. The modern corruptions in our American system are noticed and disliked by these backward nations. The more recent lifestyle of live-in marriages appear to be abominable to most of them, but Shabazz explains how this corruption has spread to their country. Mutta may be likened somewhat to the immoral trial marriage, as practiced in America, etc., live-in arrangement of modern times. When viewed in the light of the Holy Quran, Mutta is shown up to be exactly the same as living in a state of zina, adultery. A state where the man is interested only in satisfying his animal lust, male ego, etc., throwing overboard all of the principles of permanent conjugal values as enjoined by Allah Ta'ala. Today, Allah aids us to see the evil in this. A man enters in a mutta contract with a woman for a month. When the month ends, he leaves. He came and went. Another man comes along and commits mutta with the same woman for 3 weeks. At the end of the 3 weeks, the man goes his way. Along comes a third man and a fourth man. All mutta and no permanence. Men just come and go, come and go, come and go, etc., etc. If this is not legalized prostitution, then what is it? Marriage is no come and go game. Mutta, in contradistinction, has a built-in mechanism that gives a man the freedom and the license to degrade, debase, and humiliate a member of the oppressed, much maligned sex further, under the travesty and pretext of marrying her for a period of time. No self-respecting woman would submit to such. Polygamy. A remedy or a right. Shabazz, pages 41 to 42. Unfortunately, America holds up no enviable moral standard for Arabia or other nations to pattern after. Wife swapping is still very voguish in certain areas in America. Shacking up is in vogue. Trying to Love Too was the title of a song a few years ago, and As We Lay, by Shirley Murdoch, is a more recent one, both speaking about infidelity of husbands and wives. These types of symbiosis are more preferable to the sanctimonious than a divinely structured and regulated polygamous relationship as outlined in the Holy Quran. These are the "if loving you is wrong, I don't wanna be right" ethos. Today, sex is a synonym for love. Polygamy. A remedy or a right, Shabazz, page 4. The Islamic people have tried to avoid some of the problems and crimes that befall our courts every day and the effect they have on society. Rape is a sordid act conducted by a demented, mentally deranged person and is common in the United States. Some psychologists say more people are emotionally disturbed today than at any other time of human history. Many hospital psychopathic wards are crowded, and the most popular psychologists today are the psychoanalysts. All this attests to the US being a sick society. Some would even claim that it is terminally ill. Ibid. Page 53. Most Muslims see our law system as foolish nonsense because so many criminals have a glib lawyer that can secure freedom by a technicality. Here prostitution, rape and adultery are only winked at, but to Islams they are very serious crimes. They say there is an overall increase in the crime rate in the country, making the society more unfit to live in and bringing it closer towards an ultimate catastrophic end. Christianity can't handle the ills of society, that is evident. The Islamic approach to the problem of rape is both comprehensive and organized. Firstly, it identifies the root cause of the problem. Secondly, it seeks to isolate the factors contributing to its growth and existence. And thirdly, it proceeds to eliminate the problem in its entirety. Ibid. Page 58. When they eliminate the problem in its entirety, they mean to remove the offending part or the offender himself from society in entirety. Tradition states that Muhammad thought the three most important things in this world were women, fragrant odors, and prayers. Durand says some of Muhammad's marriages were acts of kindness to the destitute widows of followers or friends, and some were diplomatic marriages to win an enemy. His crowded harem troubled him with quarrels, jealousies, and demands for pin money. He refused to indulge the extravagance of his wives, but he promised them paradise. Women and power were his only indulgence, for the rest he was a man of unassuming simplicity. The Story of Civilization, 4:172. Muhammad was a simple man that would ask no services of a slave that he had time and strength to do for himself. Despite all the wealth taken in booty and revenue, he spent little upon his family and less upon himself. He ate simple, which was quite common, such as dates, barley bread, milk and honey. He did enjoy beer and wine. He was vain and spent considerable time on his personal appearance. He perfumed his body, painted his eyes, and dyed his hair. In character he was nervous and sometimes subject to periods of melancholy. He was an unscrupulous warrior but a very just judge. At the age of 59 his health began to fail, and he often had fevers. On June 7, 632 AD, after a long period of suffering, he passed on to his paradise. Durand said, if we judge greatness by influence, he was one of the giants of history. Ibid. Page 174. When Muhammad was born, Arabia was a desert filled with rough idolatrous tribes, but at his death it was a nation. He supplanted superstition with a religion based upon Judaism and Zoroastrianism. It created a people of ruthless courage and racial pride that won hundreds of victories. Even today Arabia is a nation of power and influence throughout the world. Chapter 7. The Hebrews. Blessings of Bible polygamists. It is important in this history to also include the plural marriage beliefs and customs of the Hebrews, or Israelites descendants of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. Polygamy is mentioned and/or inferred from the first to the last book of the Holy Bible, which comes to us through the mouths of some of the greatest prophets that ever lived. All or part of those scriptures are honored by several great world religions, i.e., Jews, Muslims, Protestants, Catholics, and Mormons. These Bible prophets recorded, spoke, and lived by the word of God. Their lives had to be clean and exemplary before they were able to receive communication from God, and one of the examples they set was living plural marriage. Abraham. Father Abraham was the great and grand patriarch of the Bible, a man who is still honored as a spiritual giant by the Christians, Muslims, and Jews. God was very pleased with him and promised In thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because that Abraham obeyed my voice, and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Gen. 26:4-5. This denotes divine approval of a man's life and his lifestyle even though Abraham had 2 wives for about 19 years, and then added others. The Christian nations today refer to him as the father of the faithful and a friend of God, but still many Christians think that his marriages were adulterous, sinful and abominable. How strange that God never mentioned that to Abraham. Is it not also strange that if plural marriage were such a terrible sin, that God blessed his life, his children and posterity forever, rather than condemning them? Jacob. The great father of the house of Israel was Jacob, and he, too, lived plural marriage, and strangely enough was promised the same blessings as Abraham. After 17 years of living plural marriage, God came to him and said, a company of nations and many kings would be a part of the blessings of his posterity, and those children came from all of his wives. His lifestyle didn't seem to offend our Father in heaven, because Jacob was able to say, I have seen God face to face. Gen. 32:30. How many critics and censors of polygamy can bear such a testimony? Moses. Moses was another great prophet honored by many different nations of the world. He not only lived plural marriage himself, but gave divine laws for others to live it. Although God never criticized him for such a lifestyle, his sister, Miriam, did, and she was cursed by the Lord with a plague as a result. That should be a lesson for Israel, both then and now, who might be tempted to make the same mistake. See Num. 12:1-15. The most scholarly Bible professors of today acknowledge Moses as the great lawgiver. They wrote, Moses had no successor. He was the lawgiver, and the law which was through him was not to change with the changing generations of men. Zondervan Zenk. Of the Bible 4:291. One of these laws was known as the Levirate Law, quoted and explained on the next few pages, which is classified with the statutes and principles that do not change with time, conditions or customs. Even Paul said, the law was our schoolmaster to bring us unto Christ. Gal. 3:24. If those laws were intended to bring people to Christ, then there is no need to change them now. If the program is changed, the results will also change. David. King David was a man after God's own heart, and yet he lived plural marriage. He and his lifestyle seemed to be approved of by God until the moment that he took someone else's wife and had her husband killed. From that time on his life was cursed and judgments fell upon him and his household. His sin was taking a woman who did not rightfully belong to him. Solomon. King Solomon, David's son, was the wisest man around and did very well with plural marriage until he overdid it. His wisdom was overpowered by his lust for foreign women who ruled both him and the temple of God. His wisdom turned to foolishness as he disobeyed certain laws and restrictions pertaining to plural marriage. Gideon. Gideon was also a great man in the eyes of God and his countrymen, yet he had many wives and 71 sons to his credit. The great apostle Paul lauded him as one who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, and attained promises. Heb. 11:32-33. Gideon was not only honored by the Lord, but also by the Gideon Bible Society, who have left Bibles in hotel rooms for years. This is quite ironic for the modern Christians to so greatly honor a polygamist. Martin Luther commented on the plural marriage of these great men. The polygamy of the patriarchs, Gideon, David, Solomon, etc., was a matter of necessity, not of libertinism. The Jews were constrained to have several wives, from the necessity of the promise and of consanguinity. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob received from God the promise that he would multiply their seed as the stars of heaven, or the sands of the sea. The Jews, having their attention constantly directed to his promise, to accomplish it, were fain to take several wives each. The necessity of consanguinity was this, that when a man was elected judge or king, all his poor female relations crowded about him, and he had to take them as wives or concubines. Concubinage was lawful among the Jews, and was, indeed, a mode of aiding distressed relatives, widows and orphans, to whom it secured food and raiment. It was a burdensome imposition rather than an agreeable relaxation. Solomon's wives, most of them, were probably no more to him than my nieces, Magdalene and Elizabeth, are to me, who have remained under my roof virgins, as when they came here. Table Talk, Luther, page 304. The list of notable polygamists goes on and on. If space permitted, we could discuss the lives of many polygamist prophets, patriarchs and great kings, who were honored by the Lord, some of whom were Jair, Abdon, Ibzan, Jerubbaal, Jerahmeel, Ashur, Shahram, Rehoboam, Abijah, Josiah, Elkanah, Jehoiada, Hosea, Ahab, and Job. These men were honored in Israel, and their marriage system was their sacred law, which always was a part of the law of Israel. Whatever people may say of plural marriage, it is a well-established historical fact that it was lived by God's people for thousands of years and is one of the laws of the Bible. One of those biblical laws was called the Levirate law, which was, if brethren dwell together, and one of them die, and have no child, the wife of the dead shall not marry without unto a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go in unto her, and take her to him to wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother unto her. And it shall be, that the firstborn which she beareth shall succeed in the name of his brother, which is dead, that his name be not put out of Israel. Deut. 25:5-6. If the dead man's brother already had a wife, he was still obligated to obey that law. This was done with Ruth, her husband being dead, and having no child, nor any brother to marry. The widow, Boaz, his uncle, one of the brothers of his father, took Ruth for his wife, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance, that the name of the dead be not cut off from among his brethren, and from the gate of his place. Ruth 4:10. Judah had 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. Died without a child. When Judah said unto Onan, Go in unto thy brother's wife and marry her, and raise up seed to thy brother, Gen. 38:6, he refused and was killed. This Levirate law encompassing plural marriage was never done away with by Christ or his apostles, or they would have said so. Orson Pratt explained. Question. Was there anything connected with the gospel and teachings of Christ or his apostles, intended to abolish the law in relation to the widow of the dead? When our Savior and his servants went forth through all the cities of Israel, preaching, baptizing, and introducing into the church all who would receive their testimony, is it at all likely that they condemned those who had married a plurality of wives in obedience to the law? What would they naturally have said to a man who had married half a dozen widows of his brothers who had died childless? Would they have condemned him for keeping the law? Would they have required him to put away the widows of the dead whom the law had compelled him to marry? If he had not kept the law, would he not have been condemned by the law? Hear what the penalty of disobedience is. Cursed be he that confirmeth not all the words of this law to do them. And all the people shall say, Amen. Deut. 27:26. A man, then, was bound under a heavy curse to marry all the widows of his deceased brothers who died childless. Must he, therefore, be a castaway for doing his duty? Must he be kept without the pale of the Christian church, unless he put away all his wives, but one? Such an idea is preposterous. On the other hand, if Jesus and his servants had found a man in all Israel who had refused to obey this law, who would not marry the widows of his dead brothers, they would have reproved him as a transgressor. They would have told him that he was under a curse for neglecting to obey the law. They would have warned him to repent, and it is very doubtful whether they would have received him into the Christian church unless he first manifested his repentance by observing the law and marrying the widows as required. The Seer, O. Pratt, page 62. In the beginning of the book of Exodus it is recorded that the children of Israel were fruitful, and increased abundantly, and multiplied, and waxed exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. Ex. 1:7. This condition would continually follow them until their captivity in Babylon. The new Pharaoh was worried over these prolific people, and thought the Israelites were more and mightier than we. To offset this he set up taskmasters to afflict them, but that didn't seem to make any difference. Josephus said they were sent out to build the pyramids, Antic. 2, Chap. Lxa, Sec. 1, and undoubtedly many men were killed, died from accidents, or were overworked. To make things worse, the Pharaoh ordered Egyptian women to be midwives to Israelites, and when a child was born, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him, but if it be a daughter, then she shall live. 1:16, Jasher recorded that Pharaoh ordered his officers daily to go to Goshen to seek for the babes of the children of Israel. And when they had sought and found one, they took it from its mother's bosom by force, and threw it into the river, but the female child they left with its mother. Thus did the Egyptians do to the Israelites all the days. Book of Jasher, page 202. Adam Clarke repeated a Jewish statement of Jarchi in his book Hebrew Roots, explaining the reason Pharaoh ordered the killing of all male Israelite babies. When ye do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and ye see that the birth is broken forth, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him. Jonathan ben Uzziel gives us a curious reason for the command given by Pharaoh to the Egyptian women. Pharaoh slept, and saw in his sleep a balance, and behold the whole land of Egypt stood in one scale, and a lamb in the other. And the scale in which the lamb was outweighed that in which was the land of Egypt. Immediately he sent and called all the chief magicians, and told them his dream. And James and Jimbers, see 2 Tim. 8, who were chief of the magicians, opened their mouths and said to Pharaoh, "A child is shortly to be born in the congregation of the Israelites, whose hand shall destroy the whole land of Egypt." Therefore Pharaoh spake to the midwives, etc. Clark's Com. Of the Bible 1-294. Why do the children of Israel increase so abundantly? This is attributed to several factors. The Lord blessed them with fruitfulness. These hard-working women bore children easily compared to the soft and luxurious Egyptian women. Israelites did not abhor children, nor did they try to prevent large families, and they lived plural marriage. Clark gives an example of multiplication by numbers for the great increase of Israelites. Suppose there were only 200 years reckoned, and only 50 persons who did beget children, and these begin not to beget before they be 20 years old, and then each of them beget only 3 children. Divide this time now into 10 times 20 years. In the first time, of 50 come 150. In the second, of 150 come 450. Of them in the third, come 1350. Of them in the fourth, 4050. Of these in the fifth, 12,150. Of these in the sixth, 36,450. Of them in the seventh, 109,350. Of them in the eighth, 328,050. Of these in the ninth, 984,150. And of them in the 10th, 2,952,450. Ibid. 117. It is obvious that Pharaoh thought the death of so many males among the Israelites would leave that people with barren widows and unmarried women. However, it did not stop Israel from a rapid numerical increase because they believed in plural marriage. So his wild, insane program of killing male children was in vain. Because of the criminal slaughter of male Israelite babies by the Egyptian pharaoh, a great number of surplus women did result. To prevent so many childless women among them, the Lord revealed the principle of plural wives and prescribed laws that were to govern such a marriage system. The Holy Bible is a history of the nation of Israel. It clearly speaks of the laws of marriage given to them by the Lord, and plural marriage was one of those laws which followed them throughout their history. It was just as popular as it was sacred. Indeed, it was so closely allied with God's greatest prophets and people that it is difficult to find an ancient prophet, patriarch or king that did not comply with that sacred law. The Bible is full of polygamy. The 12 polygamous sons of Jacob were honored by Christ along with his 12 apostles in the New Testament. Those 12 sons and their descendants were called the chosen people to whom God gave his most sacred laws and the holy priesthood. If polygamy is immoral, then these ancient leaders, patriarchs and prophets were immoral. In such a case they were not worthy of anything sacred, their teachings and lives were a hypocritical farce, and they could not have been chosen of God. If polygamy were a sin, then there is no sanctity to the scriptures, because both are intimately connected with each other. It seems ridiculous that prophets could live polygamy and still talk to God if it were wrong. If it were a sin, why would God speak to all those ancient prophets who were living polygamy and not mention it to them? Can a true prophet teach one set of divine laws while continually living in sin, or can time change the laws of God? In other words, can the principle of plural marriage be sacred at one time and sinful during another? Nearly all Christian churches teach that polygamy was merely a heathen custom which God tolerated, or that God winked at it, but Christ brought new light with Christianity. It seems foolish to believe that prophets lived sinfully in their marriages for 4,000 years, but it took only a few words to change it. Is it possible that a divine law can be changed from sacred to sinful? Can a principle that produced the most chosen men of the earth, including Christ, suddenly become adultery and wicked? Each of the kings of Israel was told by the Lord to write the laws of God in their own handwriting, and then read them all their days. That he may learn to fear the Lord his God, to keep all the words of this law and these statutes, to do them. That his heart be not lifted up above his brethren, and that he turn not aside from the commandment, to the right hand, or to the left. Dut. 17:19-20. Should not Bible believers of today do the same? The laws, statutes, and commandments of God are eternal in their nature, and they are not meant to be changed or discarded just because of conditions or governments. Cultures and nations change, even their laws, customs and traditions evolve in time. But correct principles and standards of morality do not and cannot change. Chapter 8. The Jews. Polygamy increases their population. During the 1st century AD, the Jews lost their temple, their city, their nation and their priests. They had little alternative but to wander through the hostile world trying to preserve their lives. Returning to their holy city, Jerusalem, where 1 million of their people had been killed, was forbidden. In a rebellion called Bar Kokhba, 132 to 135 AD, the Jews tried to regain Judea and Palestine, where 985 towns had been wiped out and 580,000 men and women were slain. The Jewish population was reduced to half its former size. Under Roman rule, the Jews had an equal footing with other religions, but when Constantine favored the Christians, the Jews suffered heavy taxes and unfair restrictions. If a Christian and Jew got married, it meant the death penalty. The rabbis were banished in 337 AD. But in 352 they rebelled and thousands were killed and thousands more enslaved. The emperor, Julian, was a savior to them in 361 AD by reducing taxes and restrictions and allowing them to return to rebuild their temple in Jerusalem even with state funds. But two serious difficulties arose as they began digging the foundation. 1. There was a burst of flames from the ground, probably natural gas, which discouraged many from that work, and 2. Julian died, and state funds were withdrawn. Old restrictions were again imposed with even more severity. Picture. Destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 AD. Picture. Jews praying at Jerusalem's Wailing Wall, Western Wall. A remaining section of a high wall that surrounded Herod's temple. The Jewish population dwindled to 1/10 of its earlier number. They immigrated to other lands, mostly Mesopotamia and Persia, where they seemed to prosper at least in numbers. The Jewish communities in Persia multiplied rapidly, for Persian law permitted, and the Jews practiced polygamy, for reasons that we have seen under Mohammedan law. The story of civilization, Will Durand 4348. The Jews encouraged polygamy because of their surplus women. Some Jews went to Arabia, where they could also live plural marriage and dwell in peace with their fellow Semites. That polygamy survived into the Christian era is, however, asserted by Josephus and Zvai, 1 and 2, and he himself, Vita S75, seems to have had one wife in Palestine and another in Egypt. The Jewish law reached the Middle Ages with polygamy permitted, but not much practiced. So in his codification of the Jewish law, Maimonides makes it lawful for man to contract many simultaneous marriages. But this must not be taken to represent the personal opinion of Maimonides, especially if the letter attributed to him concerning the French rabbis be authentic. The law, as laid down in the Talmud and codified by Maimonides, required, however, that the husband should not only ensure to each wife adequate maintenance, each wife could claim a separate domicile, but should also secure for each full conjugal rights. It must be remembered that in the Jewish view the purpose of marriage was not to satisfy carnal desires, but to raise up a family. Hence it was not uncommon that a man was permitted and even urged to take a second wife when this purpose was unfulfilled. Occasional cases of bigamy are found in Spain as late as the 14th century. Jewish Inc. 8658. Justin Martyr is not wrong in asserting that in his time, 2nd century, Jews were permitted to have 4 or 5 wives. It was practiced among the rich and the nobility. Ibid. 10:120. It is written that the king should not multiply wives, Dude 17:17 as in the San. 21a, where the number is limited to 18, 24, or 48, according to the various interpretations given to 2 Sam. 12:8. Ibid. 10:121. Polygamy among the Jews was one of the main factors in their prolific numbers during the Dark Ages, but they usually followed the customs and laws of the various nations where they migrated. The position of a Jewish woman was legally low, but morally she was highly regarded. Plato, a Jew, said that he thanked God that he had not been born a woman, and the woman replied humbly, "I thank God that I was made according to his will." Woman in World History, E.M. White, page 176. The men were prone to take the law very seriously and tried to abide by its precepts. Some oaths were taken so seriously between Jews that his most solemn oath was taken by laying his hand upon the teats of the man receiving the pledge, hence the word testimony. Story of Civilization, Durant, 4381. Under the rules of the Talmud, early marriages were recommended, and usually a 14-year-old girl was ready, while it was about 18 for the man. The young men were encouraged to marry a girl not for her beauty, but for her qualifications as a good mother. The Talmud and the Quran, like the Old Testament, encouraged polygamy. A man may marry as many wives as he pleases, said one rabbi, but another passage in the same tractate limited the number to 4. And a third required the husband, when taking a second wife, to give a divorce to the first wife, if she should ask for it. The institution of the levirate, by which a Jew was required to marry his brother's widow, presumed polygamy, and was probably due not only to kindly sentiment, but also to a desire for a high birth rate in a community which, like all ancient and medieval societies, suffered high mortality. Having allowed such freedom of mating for the man, the rabbis made adultery a capital crime. Ibid. 4362. Polygamy was discouraged in the Christian nations and even some of the others, so it began to be a diminishing doctrine among the Jews. They began to write rules and regulations against it. Later enactments of the institution of the ketubah, which was introduced by the rabbis, still further discouraged polygamy, and subsequent enactments of the Geonim. See Muller's Muftiya, Berlin, 1891, page 282. However, many Jews continued to accept plural marriages until around the year 1000 AD. At that time Gershom ben Judah brought about a change in the doctrine. Polygamy was practiced by rich Jews in Islamic lands, but was rare among the Jews of Christendom. Post-Talmudic rabbinical literature refers 1,000 times to a man's wife, never to his wives. About the year 1000 Rabbi Gershom ben Judah of Mainz decreed the excommunication of any polygamous Jew, and soon thereafter, in all Europe except Spain, polygamy and concubinage became almost extinct among the Jews. Cases continued to occur, however, where a wife barren for 10 years after marriage allowed her husband to take a concubine or an additional wife. Parentage was vital. The same decree of Gershom abolished the old right of the husband to divorce his wife without her consent or guilt. Divorces were probably less frequent in medieval Jewry than in modern America. The story of civil. Durant, 4380. Gershom ben Judah was called Gershom the Elder and was a French rabbi who was the founder of Talmudic studies in France and Germany. He was considered a profound and sagacious scholar, teaching and writing extensively. But his status and learning had little effect on his son, who became a Christian. Gershom was noted for such teachings as A. It was necessary to obtain the consent of both parties in order to get a divorce. B. Modification of rules concerning those who became apostates under compulsion. C. Prohibition against opening correspondence addressed to another. D. But mostly for his prohibition of polygamy. It is written of him. An express prohibition against polygamy was pronounced by R. Gershom B. Judah, the Light of the Exile, 960-1028, which was soon accepted in all the communities of northern France and of Germany. The Jews of Spain and of Italy, as well as those of the Orient, continued to practice polygamy for a long period after that time, although the influence of the prohibition was felt even in those countries. Some authorities suggested that R. Gershom's decree was to be enforced for a time only, namely, up to 5000 AM, 1240 AD, probably believing that the Messiah would appear before that time, but this opinion was overruled by that of the majority of medieval Jewish rabbis. Jewish Inc. 10-121. Gershom ben Judah was to the Jews what Wilfred Woodruff was to the Mormons. Both gave their advice and used their persuasion for their people to give up plural marriage, which was, in fact, heeded only by those who wanted to discontinue it anyway. Gershom did not persuade everyone against polygamy, and it continued among some of the Jews in various nations. People who believe in a particular religious order and then turn away from it are called apostates. The apostate then opposes the principles he once revered, is usually blinded by his opposition, often becomes like Judas, and is the worst antagonist of all. In his desperation to shake off and condemn his former beliefs, he makes false and vicious statements which soon become obvious to others. Such has happened to some Israelitish people, the Jews, and Mormons, who have turned against the doctrine of plural marriage. For instance, the authors of the Jewish Encyclopedia have shown their bias in the following statements. The prophets and the scribes looked upon it, plural marriage, with disfavor. At no time, however, was it practiced so much among the Israelites as among other nations. The ideal stature of human society, in the mind of the primitive Israelite, was a monogamous one. There is no biblical evidence that any of the prophets lived in polygamy. Polygamy was compared to polytheism or idolatrous worship. Jewish Inc. 10-120. The Jews, as with the early Christians, became influenced by the material world, its cultures, traditions and pagan laws. The living of polygamy was usually attended with persecution and poverty on the one hand, while the world offered wealth and honor on the other. It didn't take long for them to choose the latter. There comes a time when the faithful adherents to principle become outnumbered by those who oppose them, then a strange transition occurs. The faithful are labeled apostates by the apostates. However, principles do not change, but men do. The Jews can't deny that polygamy existed in the Bible, nor will they say that it was never lived by some of their people. Yet today most of them do not recognize it as a necessary principle of their faith. But as in Mormonism, there are currently a limited number of Jews in Jerusalem, as well as in other countries, who still believe and practice plural marriage. Fortunately, eternal principles and laws of God find acceptance by a few. Chapter 9. The Nephites. Polygamy not for the wicked. Unlike the Bible, the Book of Mormon doesn't say much about plural marriage. Nor did it say much about any of the other higher principles of the priesthood. This is understandable when you consider that the book was intended for a priestcraft-oriented people, blinded by tradition, custom and superstition. 1,000 contending Christian churches were leading the people down different and strange paths. The corruptions of their society and failure to learn and obey priesthood laws denote a people about to be destroyed, rather than a people about to be translated or exalted. Nephi often read the words of Isaiah to his brothers and he told them, "I did liken all scriptures unto us." El Nephi 19:23, meaning that he applied those passages to themselves as much as to anyone else. He explained that the judgments of God come upon all nations. 2 Nephi 25:3, and when the Savior appeared among the Nephites, he said, "A commandment I give unto you, that ye search these things diligently, for great are the words of Isaiah." 3 Nephi 23:1, among the last words of Mormon was his admonition to search the prophecies of Isaiah. Mormon 8:23. It seems rather strange that the Nephites would include in their historical record the 3rd and 4th chapters of Isaiah, which tell about a war so terrible that 6 out of 7 men would be killed, and 7 women shall take hold of 1 man to live plural marriage. 2 Nephi 14:1, then the next verse says, "In that day shall the branch of the Lord be beautiful and glorious." v2, such an inclusion would certainly encourage them to accept plural marriage as a desired correct and honorable principle. But Nephi knew many things he could not reveal to his brothers or other family members. He said, "I was forbidden that I should write the remainder of the things which I saw and heard." El Nephi 14:28, and again, "Mine eyes have beheld great things, yea, even too great for men. Therefore I was bidden that I should not write them." 2 Nephi 4:25, Moroni said he wanted to write more. "I was about to write more, but I am forbidden." Either 13:13, this appeared again and again in the Nephite record. Mormon explained why only a very small part of the Savior's teachings could be recorded at that time. "And now there cannot be written in this book even 100th part of the things which Jesus did truly teach unto the people. But behold, the plates of Nephi do contain the more part of the things which he taught the people. And these things have I written, which are a lesser part of the things which he taught the people, and I have written them to the intent that they may be brought again unto this people, from the Gentiles, according to the words which Jesus hath spoken. And when they shall have received this, which is expedient that they should have first, to try their faith, and if it shall so be that they shall believe these things, then shall the greater things be made manifest unto them. And if it so be that they will not believe these things, then shall the greater things be withheld from them, unto their condemnation. Behold, I was about to write them, all which were engraven upon the plates of Nephi, but the Lord forbade it, saying, I will try the faith of my people." 3 Nephi 26:6-11. If people are too worldly or proud to accept the first principles of the gospel, there is no reason to offer them any more, as Jesus said, "It is not meet to take the children's bread and cast it unto the dogs." Mark 7:27. Thus the Book of Mormon seemed to avoid the subject of plural marriage as much as possible, and even the little that was written was half hidden in the wording. Many times it would say a man had sons and daughters, and then describing another man it would say he begat many sons and daughters, but it seldom mentioned the exact numbers of children. Had that been the case, plural marriage might have been inferred by those high numbers, as it was in the case of Ariha. And it came to pass that Ariha did execute judgment upon the land in righteousness all his days, whose days were exceeding many. And he begat sons and daughters, yea, he begat 31, among whom were 23 sons. Either 7:1-2. With 31 children, he had to be a polygamist. And if he was a man of righteousness all his days and he had 31 children in polygamy, it must mean that the Lord was not displeased with him or his marriages. Amulek said as he was journeying to see a near kindred that an angel of the Lord appeared unto him, and told him about a chosen man of God. Amulek was instructed to return and take this holy man into his house and care for his needs. He did this, and as a result Amulek recorded that Alma blessed mine house, he hath blessed me, and my women, and my children, and my father and my kinsfolk. See Alma 10:7-11. Amulek must have been a good man because, first of all, he was instructed by an angel of God. He had possibly taken as wives some of the widows left from the many wars, and Alma blessed his wives, or women as he called them. Amulek was recognized as a righteous man by God and obviously would have lived righteously with those women. One of the most faithful men described in the Book of Mormon was the brother of Jared. It is said of him, "And there were many whose faith was so exceeding strong, even before Christ came, who could not be kept from within the veil, but truly saw with their eyes the things which they had beheld with an eye of faith, and they were glad." And behold, we have seen in this record that one of these was the brother of Jared, for so great was his faith in God, that when God put forth his finger, he could not hide it from the sight of the brother of Jared, because of his word which he had spoken unto him. Which word he had obtained by faith. Either 12:19-20. Because of his great faith, the Lord could not withhold anything from his sight, wherefore he showed him all things, for he could no longer be kept without the veil. Ether 12:21, he was so inspired that the things which he wrote were mighty even as thou art, unto the overpowering of man to read them. V24, here was a good man, a man who conducted his life and his family, according to the will of the Lord. He was worthy to raise a large family with many wives, which is what must have happened, as we read that the number of the sons and the daughters of the brother of Jared were 22 souls, Ether 6:20, indicating that he, too, must have had more than one wife. Another indication of plural marriage in the Book of Mormon is also recorded in Ether. Wherefore every man did cleave unto that which was his own, with his hands, and would not borrow neither would he lend. And every man kept the hilt of his sword in his right hand, in the defense of his property and his own life, and of his wives and children. Ether 14:2. This passage is talking of every man, singular, and his property, but mentions his wives, plural. Just like any principle and doctrine of the gospel, both the righteous and wicked have been permitted to obey and live them, for whatever reasons, and it is no different with plural marriage. There is the example of Riblikish, a wicked man. Who did not do that which was right in the sight of the Lord, for he did have many wives and concubines, and did lay that upon men's shoulders, which was grievous to be borne, yea, he did tax them with heavy taxes, and with the taxes he did build many spacious buildings. And he did erect him an exceedingly beautiful throne, and he did build many prisons, and whoso would not be subject unto taxes, he did cast into prison, and whoso was not able to pay taxes he did cast into prison, and he did cause that they should labor continually for their support. And whoso refused to labor he did cause to be put to death. Ether 10:5-6. Certainly this is enough evidence to show Riblikish was a very wicked man. Yet he did have many wives and concubines and did afflict the people with his whoredoms and abominations. V5:7, because of his free agency, he was entitled to this lifestyle as much as anyone else, but it certainly doesn't mean he took additional wives because he wanted to obey God and become a more righteous man. Along these same lines, King Noah, son of righteous King Zeniff, did not walk in the ways of his father and became corrupted by selfish lusts and vanity. It is said of him, "For behold, he Noah did not keep the commandments of God, but he did walk after the desires of his own heart. And he had many wives and concubines. And he did cause his people to commit sin, and do that which was abominable in the sight of the Lord. Yea, and they did commit whoredoms and all manner of wickedness. And it came to pass that he placed his heart upon his riches, and he spent his time in riotous living with his wives and his concubines, and so did also his priests spend their time with harlots." Messiah 11:2-14. The devil enjoys influencing wicked men to twist and abuse righteous principles, and polygamy seems to be one of his favorite areas, as there are countless cases of those who lived that doctrine unrighteously. Riblikish and Noah were just two examples of the type of men whom the Lord did not want to live plural marriage, and apparently there were many others during the time of Jacob, Lehi's son, for he warned the people. "And now, my brethren, I have spoken unto you concerning pride, and those of you which have afflicted your neighbor, and persecuted him because ye were proud in your hearts, of the things which God hath given you, what say ye of it? Do ye not suppose that such things are abominable unto him who created all flesh? And the one being is as precious in his sight as the other. And all flesh is of the dust, and for the selfsame end hath he created them, that they should keep his commandments and glorify him forever. And now I make an end of speaking unto you concerning this pride. And were it not that I must speak unto you concerning a grosser crime, my heart would rejoice exceedingly because of you. But the word of God burdens me because of your grosser crimes. For behold, thus saith the Lord, this people begin to wax in iniquity, they understand not the scriptures, for they seek to excuse themselves in committing whoredoms, because of the things which were written concerning David. and Solomon his son. Behold, David and Solomon truly had many wives and concubines, which thing was abominable before me, saith the Lord. Wherefore, thus saith the Lord, I have led this people forth out of the land of Jerusalem, by the power of mine arm, that I might raise up unto me a righteous branch from the fruit of the loins of Joseph. Wherefore, I the Lord God will not suffer that this people shall do like unto them of old. Wherefore, my brethren, hear me, and hearken to the word of the Lord. For there shall not any man among you have save it be one wife, and concubines he shall have none. For I, the Lord God, delight in the chastity of women. And whoredoms are an abomination before me, thus saith the Lord of hosts. Jacob 2:20-28. The key words here are among you talking of the wicked people he has just been addressing. Why should they be allowed to continue in the abuse of such a holy principle? As verse 23 states, these people were guilty of 3 serious sins. 1. They were beginning to wax in iniquity. 2. They did not understand the scriptures. 3. They were committing whoredoms, multiplying wives, like David and Solomon. For these reasons, the Lord wanted them restricted to only one wife and no concubines. Plural marriage must have been practiced among the Nephites before this time, or why else would this limitation now be placed on them by the Lord? Because of their actions, the Nephite people, generally speaking, had really become unworthy of even one wife. As Jacob goes on to describe their iniquities, it becomes even more evident why the Lord restricted them to one wife. Behold, ye have done greater iniquities than the Lamanites, our brethren. Ye have broken the hearts of your tender wives, and lost the confidence of your children, because of your bad examples before them, and the sobbings of their hearts ascend up to God against you. Jacob 2:35. Except ye repent, the land is cursed for your sakes, and the Lamanites, which are not filthy like unto you, nevertheless they are cursed with a sore cursing, shall scourge you even unto destruction. Behold, the Lamanites your brethren, whom ye hate because of their filthiness and the cursing which hath come upon their skins, are more righteous than you, for they have not forgotten the commandment of the Lord, which was given unto our fathers that they should have save it were one wife. And concubines they should have none, and there should not be whoredoms committed among them. And now, this commandment they observe to keep, wherefore, because of this observance, in keeping this commandment, the Lord God will not destroy them, but will be merciful unto them, and one day they shall become a blessed people. Jacob 3:5-6. The Lamanites apparently had also been guilty of abusing the principle of plural marriage, and the Lord had already commanded them to have just one wife, but because of their renewed obedience, they would one day become a blessed people, indicating their people would once again be righteous enough to live plural marriage. But it was harder to get the Nephites to obey, and because of their disobedience and abuse of plural marriage, they were under greater condemnation. But did this instruction of having one wife apply to the righteous leaders and people who tried to live close to the Lord and obey all his commandments? Certainly there must have been a few of them scattered throughout the Nephite communities who felt that instruction did not pertain to them. Jacob 2:24, referred to David and Solomon's having many wives and concubines, which thing was abominable before me. We need to remember that when David and Solomon were in good favor with the Lord, he blessed them in every way, which included their wives, but when they apostatized, they were no longer worthy of those good women. David was guilty of murder and adultery, and Solomon took foreign wives which led to further unrighteousness. Foreign marriages brought foreign religions, and the king compromised the convictions which he had expressed in his dedicatory prayer for the temple, I Kings 8:23-27, by engaging in syncretistic worship to placate his wives. This violent breach of Israel's covenant could not go unpunished. Illis. Bible Dict. Vol. 3:1472. After such sins and multiplying wives out of lust, David and Solomon were no longer worthy to live plural marriage or to take additional wives. This is what the scripture is referring to as being abominable before me. With this explanation, it becomes a little more clear what Jacob meant when he said, "And now it came to pass that the people of Nephi, under the reign of the second king, began to grow hard in their hearts, and indulged themselves somewhat in wicked practices, such as like unto David of old desiring many wives and concubines, and also Solomon, his son." Jacob 1:15. Both David and Solomon corrupted themselves, their families and their kingdoms through their immorality. The purpose of plural marriage is to live pure lives and raise up a righteous posterity. They failed to do this, and so did the Nephites, and thus they were forbidden from taking plural wives. It is easy to understand the potential nature of good and evil in all things. For example, a fire can warm a house or burn it down. A gun may provide food for hungry people, or it can kill the people themselves. So it is with plural marriage, it can exalt or destroy. Like any other marriage, it is neither good nor bad in and of itself. Its value is determined by the way it is used or abused. Jacob left the door open for the righteous to live plural marriage when he said, "For if I will, saith the Lord of hosts, raise up seed unto me, I will command my people, otherwise they shall hearken unto these things. For behold, I, the Lord, have seen the sorrow, and heard the mourning of the daughters of my people in the land of Jerusalem, yea, and in all the lands of my people, because of the wickedness and abominations of their husbands." Jacob 2:30-31. So apparently it was just as difficult for men to live this principle righteously in those days as it has been in our dispensation. So Jacob issued a type of manifesto for his time similar to what was declared and accepted in the LDS Church in 1890. Orson Pratt commented, "But because the Lord dealt thus with this small branch of the house of Israel that came to America, under their peculiar circumstances, there are those at the present day who will appeal to this passage in the Book of Mormon as something universally applicable in regard to man's domestic relations. The same God that commanded one branch of the house of Israel in America to take but one wife when the numbers of the two sexes were about equal, gave a different command to the hosts of Israel in Palestine. But let us see the qualifying clause given in the Book of Mormon on this subject. After having reminded the people of the commandment delivered by Lehi, in regard to monogamy, the Lord says, "For, if I will raise up seed unto me, I will command my people, otherwise they shall hearken unto these things, that is, if I will raise up seed among my people of the house of Israel. I will give them a commandment on this subject, but if I do not give this commandment, they shall hearken to the law which I give unto their father Lehi." That is the meaning of the passage, and this very passage goes to prove that plurality was a principle God did approve under circumstances when it was authorized by him. JD 13-191-92, October 7, 1869. Of course, he is talking here about accepted procedure of the church, allowing for the fact that there will always be a few who wish to obey eternal principles in or out of the church. The Book of Mormon is an amazing book. It is so amazing that it must be true, because truth is stranger than fiction. Unlike fiction, however, it teaches principles, religious themes, history, and a vast amount of common sense. It depicts the lives of both good and bad men as descriptively and eloquently as any in the Bible. From such illustrative examples comes a precious understanding of good and evil, and the fruits resulting from each. Our actions determine our outcome, not merely the beliefs we claim nor what we possess. For instance, gold is neither good nor bad, but its use by either good or bad individuals determines its significance and value. Both good and bad individuals hold government offices, and how they use that power becomes a factor in determining their true worth. So now we come to the principle of plural marriage. It, too, can be received and lived by both good and bad men and women. It can be righteously practiced, or it can be terribly abused. The Book of Mormon gives us important instructions by providing a glimpse into the fateful history of plural marriage. We can learn from the many examples that plural marriage is not a principle to be lived by the wicked, and God will not tolerate His church in any dispensation to abuse it for long. Chapter 10. The Christians. Christ fulfilled the law. When Jesus Christ was born, polygamy was known and lived by various nationalities all over the world. Many of the Jews that He associated with either talked about it or were living it. How could these learned biblical scholars teach about the ancient prophets without bringing up the subject of their many wives? These people were caught between the ancient Israel laws that advocated polygamy and those of the Roman Empire that discouraged it. So, isn't it strange that on the written record Jesus never said a single word about either law? In all the writings of His disciples, never did they say a word for or against plural marriage. This unusual mystery certainly indicates that some sort of editing must have been done in the original manuscripts. If Jesus had said something negative about plural marriage, there would be no reason to hide it, because monogamy was the most common form of marriage, and enforcing monogamy would have given the Christians more favor with the Roman government. But no law for monogamy is included in the New Testament, nor is there any law against polygamy. If Jesus said anything favorable about plural marriage, why was it omitted from the New Testament manuscripts? There are at least two reasons. One is because some contemporary Christians, like some Mormons, hated that principle. They would rather obey the law of the land than this law of God. They would edit manuscripts and history to eliminate anything in favor of that subject. Secondly, they would encourage monogamy to protect themselves from persecution. By gaining favor with the Roman government, they could find jobs, acceptance, and political position. It is a story that would be repeated nearly 2,000 years later in the restored church. This is understandable when we read the prophecy of Nephi, who mentioned a book that is a record of the Jews, which contains the covenants of the Lord, which he hath made unto the house of Israel, and that contains covenants of the Lord ... of great worth unto the Gentiles. But after it goes forth, a great and abominable church ... have taken away from the gospel of the Lamb many parts which are plain and most precious, and also many covenants of the Lord have they taken away. 1 Nephi 13:23-26. Nephi continued by saying that an exceeding great many do stumble, yea, insomuch that Satan hath great power over them. Verse 29. See also the rest of that chapter and all of chapter 14. Changes and omissions are difficult to prove, since we do not have any original or early Bible manuscripts to compare with. However, we do have some evidence from within the Bible itself. For instance, all of the Bibles published before King James translation had a most interesting prophecy about the Messiah, Christ, who was to come. From the Geneva Bible published in London in 1599 comes this photocopy. Photocopy of verses 8, 9, 10, 11, 45th Psalm, 1599 Geneva Bible. Again, the Church of England Bible published in 1636 has an interesting footnote attached to their translation. Photocopy of verses 6 to 15. The Apostle Orson Pratt commented on this. King James translators were not willing that this passage above should have a literal translation, according to the former English rendering, lest it should give countenance to polygamy. Therefore, they altered the translation to honorable women instead of wives. But any person acquainted with the original can see that the first translators have given the true rendering of that passage. The Seer, page 160. In his day Jesus could see the need for living plural marriage, for about the time of his birth, Herod had ordered thousands of male children killed, leaving a great surplus of women Christ's age. Added to this, many young men were killed in the usual wars and depredations of life. So why should Jesus and the apostles prohibit plural marriages which would solve the problem? They also had children. The chosen lineage of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Jesus, and his apostles would still be represented on the earth in these last days, as latter-day prophets have confirmed. Among the other things, George Q. Cannon said, there are those in this audience who are descendants of the old 12 apostles and, shall I say it, yes, descendants of the Savior himself. His seed is represented in this body of men. Following press. Cannon, President Snow arose and said that what Bro. Cannon had stated respecting the literal descendants among this company of the old apostles, and the Savior himself is true. The Savior's seed is represented in this body of men. Journal of Press. Roger Clausen, pages 374-375. We say it was Jesus Christ who was married, to be brought into the relation whereby he could see his seed, before he was crucified. Has he indeed passed by the nature of angels, and taken upon himself the seed of Abraham, to die without leaving a seed to bear his name on the earth? No. But when the secret is fully out, the seed of the blessed shall be gathered in the last days, and he who has not the blood of Abraham flowing in his veins, who has not one particle of the Savior's in him, I am afraid is a stereotyped Gentile. Who will be left out and not be gathered in the last days, for I tell you it is the chosen of God, the seed of the blessed, that shall be gathered. I do not despise to be called a son of Abraham, if he had a dozen wives, or to be called a brother, a son, a child of the Savior, if he had Mary, and Martha, and several others, as wives, and though he did cast 7 devils out of one of them, it is all the same to me. Well, then, he shall see his seed, and who shall declare his generation, for he was cut off from the earth? I shall say here, that before the Savior died, he looked upon his own natural children, as we look upon ours. He saw his seed, and immediately afterwards he was cut off from the earth. But who shall declare his generation? They had no father to hold them in honorable remembrance. They passed into the shades of obscurity, never to be exposed to mortal eye as the seed of the Blessed One. For no doubt had they been exposed to the eye of the world, those infants might have shared the same fate as the children in Jerusalem in the days of Herod, when all the children were ordered to be slain under such an age, with the hopes of slaying the infant Savior. History is replete with circumstances of neck-or-nothing politicians dyeing their hands in the blood of those who stood in their way to the throne or to power. That seed has had its influence upon the chosen of God in the last days. The same spirit inspires them that inspired their father, who bled and died upon the cross after the manner of the flesh. Orson Hyde, J.D. 182-83. 2 years later Orson Hyde spoke again on this subject. Abraham was chosen of God for the purpose of raising up a chosen seed, and a peculiar people unto his name. Jesus Christ was sent into the world for a similar purpose, but upon a more extended scale. Christ was the seed of Abraham, so reckoned. To these, great promises were made, one of which was, that in Abraham, and his seed, which was Christ, all the families of the earth should be blessed. When the ungodly or those not of their seed should be cut off from the earth, and no family remaining on earth except their own seed. Then in Abraham and in Christ, all the families and kindreds of the earth will be blessed Satan bound, and the millennium fully come. Then the meek will inherit the earth, and God's elect reign undisturbed, at least, for 1,000 years. Is there no way provided for those to come into this covenant relation who may not possess in their veins any of the blood of Abraham or of Christ? Yes. By doing the works of Abraham and of Christ in the faith of Abraham and of Christ, not in unbelief and unrighteousness, like the wicked world who have damned themselves in their own corruption and unbelief. Orson Hyde, J.D. 4:260. When Jesus frequently counseled his followers to search the scriptures, John 5:39, he was referring to the Old Testament. He did not preach against the laws of Moses, nor did he try to change or do away with them. At the beginning of his ministry he made it clear. Think not that I am come to destroy the law, or the prophets. Matt 5:17, he even suggested that the law would continue long afterwards. Till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law, till all be fulfilled. Matt 5:18, then he continued by saying that if man would teach these Old Testament laws as scripture, he would be considered great in heaven. Orson Pratt explained. Some may say that when Christ came, all things were done away and all things became new. But who does not know that this had reference only to the law of carnal commandments and ordinances which Christ came to fulfill? Who does not know that there were many commandments and laws which were connected with the law of ordinances which were continued under the gospel? The 10 Commandments were not done away in Christ. Prayer, which was practiced under the law, was also necessary under the gospel. The gospel did not abolish the law against stealing, against killing, against taking the name of the Lord in vain, against false witnesses, against drunkenness, or against any other abominations. Christ did not do away the law of doing good to one's neighbor, the law of uprightness and honesty which should characterize their dealings, one with another. Christ, by introducing the gospel, never intended to abolish the law practiced among Israel in helping the poor, the needy, the fatherless, and the widow. Hence there were hundreds of commands and laws under the patriarchal and Mosaic dispensations which Christ did not come to do away. What was moral, and good, and righteous before Christ came was equally so after he came, unless we can find some evidence to the contrary. The Seer, page 63. Christ was the Messiah to come in the meridian of time. His mission was to teach and live as an example of the laws of God. Although he lived without sin, he was baptized not for the remission of sins, but to fulfill, or obey, the law. Baptism was a law imposed upon everyone, and Jesus was no exception to that law. Plural marriage was also a law, and he was no exception to that one either. Some of the modern Christians who believe that the law was done away with at the coming of Christ quote Luke in support of this. The law and the prophets were until John. Since that time the kingdom of God is preached, and every man presseth into it. Luke 16:16. But if this were literally true, then all the laws including the 10 Commandments were to be done away at the coming of Christ. The next verse somewhat contradicts this idea, however. And it is easier for heaven and earth to pass than one tittle of the law to fail. Luke 16:17. Thus, the law does not change, it cannot be done away, and Christ did not destroy it. These same verses were greatly clarified in Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible. Then said Jesus unto them, The law and the prophets testify of me, yea, and all the prophets who have written, even until John, have foretold of these days. Since that time, the kingdom of God is preached, and every man who seeketh truth presseth into it. And it is easier for heaven and earth to pass than for one tittle of the law to fail. And why teach ye the law, and deny that which is written, and condemn him whom the Father hath sent to fulfill the law, that ye might all be redeemed? Luke 16:17-20. All the law and all the prophets up to the time of John pointed to the coming of the Messiah, who was the object of all the law and their prophecies. There would be no new law as good scholars recognized. Neither Jesus nor John came preaching something absolutely new. Theirs was a word of fulfillment. Zondervan Zenk. Of the Bible 3:642, but no one made it more clear than Jesus himself when he said, Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. Matt 5:17. To fulfill the law means to obey and carry out. For this reason, Christ obeyed and lived the law of polygamy, along with all God's other laws. A Christian minister by the name of James Campbell traveled the world in the 1860s and studied its many religions. One of the most interesting parts of his study was the practice of plural marriage. He eventually wrote a book about it and said, "Let the inspiration and perpetual authority of the Old Testament be fully admitted, yet the modern Christian may say, we do not live under the first covenant, nor observe the ceremonies of Moses, but we live in the new dispensation, under the full light of the gospel. Christ has fulfilled the ritual and emblematical ordinances of the law, and set them aside, and it is presumed that the ancient marriage laws have been set aside among the rest, and superseded by the purer system of monogamy. But this assumption cannot be supported either by sufficient testimony or by valid reasoning. The social system of polygamy had existed before the time of Moses, and had no dependence upon the ceremonial law which was instituted in his day. That law only confirmed it as a pre-existent institution. Marriage laws cannot be regarded as merely ritual and emblematical. They are moral and fundamental, guarding the dearest rights and punishing the deepest wrongs of mankind. They are, therefore, equally permanent with those laws protecting life and property, those inculcating obedience to parents and rulers, and those maintaining the sanctity of oaths. All these, together with the marriage laws, existed before the time of Moses and have survived the time of Christ. They are among those laws that Jesus came not to subvert but to ratify, as Dr. George Campbell of Edinburgh has, in Matt. v. 17, very exactly translated the terms Hebrew and Hebrew. Hence the marriage system of polygamy never formed a part of that ceremonial dispensation which was abrogated by the New Testament, nor has it ever been proved that the New Testament was designed to effect any change in it, but the presumption is that this new dispensation has also left it, as it found it abiding still in force. If any change were to be made in an institution of such long standing, confirmed by positive law, it could obviously be made only by equally positive and explicit ordinances or enactments of the gospel. But such enactments are wanting. Christ himself was altogether silent in respect to polygamy, not once alluding to it, yet it was practiced at the time of his advent throughout Judea and Galilee, and in all the other countries of Asia and Africa, and, without doubt, by some of his own disciples. The book of the Acts is equally silent as the four Gospels are. No allusion to it is found in any of the sermons or instructions or discussions of the apostles and early saints recorded in that book. It was not because Jesus or the apostles durst not condemn it, had they considered it sinful, that they did not speak of it, for Jesus hesitated not to denounce the sins of hypocrisy, covetousness, and adultery, and even to alter and amend, apparently, the ancient laws respecting divorce and retaliation, but he never rebuked them for their polygamy, nor instituted any change in that system. And this uniform silence, so far as it implies anything, implies approval. John the Baptist was thrown into prison, where he was afterwards beheaded, for reproving King Herod on account of his adultery. And we cannot doubt that, if he had considered polygamy to be sinful, he would have mentioned it, for Herod's father was, just before that time, living with 9 wives, whose names are recorded by Josephus in his Antiquities of the Jews, but John only reproved him for marrying Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, while his brother was living. He administered the same reproof to Herod that Nathan had formerly done to David, and for similar reasons. The apostles always denounced the sins of fornication and adultery, but never denounced polygamy, nor intimated in any way that it was a sin. In all the long and painful catalogues of sins enumerated in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd chapters of Romans, many of which relate to the unlawful indulgence of the amorous propensities, polygamy is not once named. It is the very place where it is morally certain that it would have been named if it were sinful, and, that it is not there named, we are fully warranted to believe that it is not sinful. The History and Philosophy of Marriage, Campbell, pages 68 to 71. In all the clouds of confusion, man will frequently fail or fall. Custom, tradition, circumstances, regulations and public law may lead mankind away from the laws of God. Jesus constantly fought against the apostate traditions of the Jews, saying, "Why do ye also transgress the commandment of God by your tradition?" Matt. 15:3. Regulations and laws are often made by traditions, and the laws governing monogamy were among them. If Christ had changed the moral laws, he would have proved himself a fraud. Morality included marriage and all the principles and laws connected with it, and God said they could not and would not change. He declared, "For I am the Lord, I change not." Mal. 3:6, and so shall I keep thy law continually forever and forever. Psalms 119:44. Much more could be said in this chapter about the marriages of Christ and his apostles, including their plural marriages. But for further information, see this author's books entitled Jesus Was Married and Polygamy in the Bible. Chapter 11. The Catholics. Polygamy against secular and ecclesiastical law. As is true in every dispensation when prophets bring the word of God to man, the gospel of Jesus Christ also began to be changed within a few years of its beginning. Departure from true principles did not occur suddenly, but rather with small compromises, gradual changes and alterations similar to the setting of the sun when darkness slowly overtakes the light. During Christ's ministry there were thousands who came to listen and follow him, but just before his crucifixion, all the disciples forsook him and fled. Matt. 26:56. Jesus warned his disciples that dangers would come from within their own ranks. They shall put you out of the synagogues churches, John 16:2. Paul wrote to the saints, the mystery of iniquity doth already work, 2 thus. 2:7, and I marvel that ye are so soon removed from him that called you into the grace of Christ unto another gospel, Gal. 1:6. To the saints in Asia he said, all they which are in Asia be turned away from me. 2 Tim. 1:15, but evil men and seducers shall wax worse and worse, deceiving, and being deceived. 2 Tim. 3:13, then again. The time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lust shall they heap to themselves teachers, having itching ears, and they shall turn away their ears from the truth, and shall be turned unto fables. 2 Tim. 4:3-4. Peter also warned. But there were false prophets also among the people, even as there shall be false teachers among you, who privily shall bring in damnable heresies. 2 Peter 2:1. John also noted this apostasy when he said they had tried them which say they are apostles, and are not, and hast found them liars. Rev. 2:2. He also wrote to the 7 churches in Asia, condemning each of them for extremely wicked sins. Jude tried to persuade the saints to earnestly contend for the faith which was once delivered to the saints. For there are certain men crept in unawares. Jude 1:3-4. How can such conditions be possible? Persecution is not the only means to destroy religion, its worst danger comes from the weaknesses and unfaithfulness of its own leaders. If opposition by force against the truth is not successful, Satan then resorts to infiltration. At first he hoists certain half-hearted men into positions of power and influence within the ranks of Christ's own disciples. He selects men who will abandon the laws of God for the laws of man. These compromisers will, for a price, barter off the principles of Christ for the traditions of men. The devil prizes such men above any others because they prove to be the most effectual at deception and destruction. These champions of spiritual darkness become tempted and led away by the influences of wealth, the honors of men, and the desire to be at peace with their enemies. Such semi-apostates are usually found busily engaged in mercantile traffic, money-making schemes, and are absorbed in their temporal affluence among all men. They are so concerned about the temporal progress of the church and in supporting the laws, traditions, and leaders of the land that they will barter away eternal principles to accomplish temporal peace. In their aspirations to acquire the praise of other men, they lose their bonds with heaven. These spiritually dead leaders sell eternal blessings for a mess of mortal pottage. In their eagerness to magnify the progress of the world and acquire the praise of worldly leaders, they lose sight of their dependence upon God and His Word. At this critical point of history, the Church stood in its greatest peril. Rome was the hub of the great Roman Empire, and today it is the headquarters for the Catholic Church. The story of the transition from one of the most corrupt powers on earth to one of the most ritualistic religions is a fascinating study. The evolution of their attitude toward marriage is also very interesting, even appalling. The Roman leaders consecutively took numerous wives and tossed them aside like old shoes, while Catholicism restricted their leaders from having any wives at all. To understand this change in marital attitude, we must go back to the lives and writings of Christ's apostles. As a Roman, Paul wrote in one of his letters, "Have we not power to lead about a sister, a wife, as well as other apostles, and as the brethren of the Lord, and Cephas?" 1 Cor. 9:5. He also said, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers. For there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God." Rom. 13:1. This could be the origin of the expression, "When in Rome, do as the Romans do." Paul was a Roman, he spoke as a Roman, and he honored the laws of the Romans. This would also become the reason given for many of the Christians to conform to the laws and customs of their particular secular government. It would be the justification offered by Christians for changing God's biblical laws of plural marriage to monogamous laws of the land. But Paul apparently did not honor all Roman laws because in the end he was accused of political disobedience, or at least a verbal expression of it, which was a capital offense. Tertullian, in his writings dated about 200 AD, reported that Paul had been beheaded in Rome. Eusebius, one of the early Christian bishops, 264 to 349 AD, records that under Nero Paul, after having pleaded his cause, was sent a prisoner to Rome, and that Paul passed 2 whole years at Rome as a prisoner at large, and that in that city, he finished his life with martyrdom. Ecclesiastical History, Eusebius, page 74. In the beginning Rome was very unfriendly toward Christians. Later, however, she would court, tempt and finally seduce them with Roman laws in opposition to the laws of Christ. 1. Westermarck wrote a 3-volume work entitled The History of Human Marriage, London, 1921, and later summarized it in a book called Simply Marriage, in which he stated, "The New Testament does not expressly prohibit polygyny, except in the case of a bishop and a deacon, and, he might have added, the ban was by Paul and not Christ. No council of the church in the earliest centuries opposed polygyny, and no obstacle was put in the way of its practice by kings in countries where it had occurred in the times of paganism, for example in Ireland and among the Merovingian kings." Marriage, Westermarck, page 62. It is said that Julius Caesar attempted to have a law passed in favor of polygamy, but could not put it into effect. He found for himself that once a tradition is set into society, it is most difficult to extract. The Christians had not been instructed by law to obey any particular form of marriage, monogamous, polygamous or celibate. It was their free choice. According to Martin Luther, celibacy was first imposed on church leaders over 2 centuries after the time of Christ. The celibacy of spiritual persons began in the time of Cyprian, who lived 250 years after the birth of Christ. The Table Talk of Martin Luther, Hazlitt, page 307. George Q. Cannon spoke of the more lasting nature of polygamous nations as compared to monogamous ones, Rome, for example. But the history of the world goes to prove that the practice of this principal plural marriage, even by nations ignorant of the gospel, has resulted in greater good to them than the practice of monogamy or the one-wife system in the so-called Christian nations. Where are the nations that have existed from time immemorial? They are not to be found in Christian monogamic Europe, but in Asia, among the polygamic races China, Japan, Hindustan and the various races of that vast continent. Those nations, from the most remote times, practiced plural marriage handed down to them by their forefathers. Although they are looked upon by the nations of Europe as semi-civilized, you will not find among them woman prostituted, debased and degraded as she is through Christendom. She may be treated coldly and degraded, but among them, except where the Christian element prevails to a large extent, she is not debased and polluted as she is among the so-called Christian nations. It is a fact worthy of note that the shortest-lived nations of which we have record have been monogamic. Rome, with her arts, sciences and warlike instincts, was once the mistress of the world, but her glory faded. She was a monogamic nation, and the numerous evils attending that system early laid the foundation for that ruin, which eventually overtook her. The strongest sayings of Jesus recorded in the New Testament were leveled against the dreadful corruptions practiced in Rome, and wherever the Romans held sway. The leaven of their institutions had worked its way into the Jewish nation, Jewry or Palestine being then a Roman province, and governed by Roman officers, who brought with them their wicked institutions, and Jesus denounced the practices which prevailed there. JD 13:202. When did Christianity adopt the law of monogamy from the Romans? The answer is easy. The marriage laws of the Romans entered into Christianity about the same time most of their false doctrines did, nearly 300 years after the establishment of Christianity. It is true that many small and gradual changes took place within the Church of Christ shortly after the death of Jesus, but most of the critical deviations came through the actions of Emperor Constantine. He probably had more influence on what Christians eventually believed than did Christ himself. The Diocletian oppression was the last of the great persecutions brought by pagan Rome against Christianity as a whole. A stupendous change, amounting to a revolution, now appears in the affairs of the Church. Constantine, known in history as Constantine the Great, became Emperor of Rome AD 306 and reigned 31 years. The Great Apostasy, James E. Talmage, page 75. Constantine turned from the persecution of Christians to placing them in a position of worldly honor, rank and the highest of privileges. The unbelieving Romans became Christians, and the Christians began to think, act, and live like Romans. Philip Schaff, a noted historian, describes this conversion. The reign of Constantine the Great marks the transition of the Christian religion from under persecution by the secular government to union with the same, the beginning of the state-church system. Page 4. The despised sect, which, like its founder in the days of his humiliation, had not where to lay its head, is raised to sovereign authority in the state, enters into the prerogatives of the pagan priesthood, grows rich and powerful, builds countless churches out of the stones of idol temples to the honor of Christ and his martyrs, employs the wisdom of Greece and Rome to vindicate the foolishness of the cross, exerts a molding power upon civil legislation, rules the national life, and leads off the history of the world. Page 5. Now, too, for the first time, could ecumenical councils be held, in which the Church of the whole Roman Empire was represented, and fixed its articles of faith in an authoritative way. Page 7. Constantine, the first Christian Caesar, the founder of Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire, and one of the most gifted, energetic, and successful of the Roman emperors, was the first representative of the imposing idea of a Christian theocracy, or of that system of policy which assumes all subjects to be Christians, connects civil and religious rights, and regards church and state as the two arms of one and the same divine government on earth. Page 12, History of the Christian Church, Schaff, Boll. 3. Thus, the gradual merging of Christ and Caesar culminated at the time of Constantine. Here was a man for all seasons, a man who revolutionized both Christianity and the Roman Empire. Romans became Christians and Christians became Romans. What kind of man was Constantine? A keen supporter of the gladiatorial games during his youth and a commander who threw his German prisoners to wild beasts, Constantine executed both his wife, Fausta, and his eldest son, Crispus, by ordering that they should be slowly suffocated in the hot rooms of their bathhouses. For some while he divided his allegiance between the sun god and the Christian savior, and he would appear to have valued Christian relics primarily as magic working charms. The Colosseum, Life Incorporated, page 69. Constantine was a showman. He knew how to invite, persuade, and rule over people. As an emperor he certainly acted the part. He not only enmeshed the Christians and the Romans nationally, but he also blended their religious, economic, social and political ideals. When meeting with religious leaders, the emperor waited until all the bishops had taken their seats before making his entry. He was clad in gold and covered with precious stones in the fashion of an oriental sovereign. A chair of gold had been made ready for him, and when he had taken his place, the bishops seated themselves. Catholic Inc. 244. How unusual that this man set the rules for the Christian Church, and yet he himself was not even a member of it. He professed it as his faith, but was not baptized until just before his death. B.H. Roberts explained why he delayed his baptism. A professed Christian for many years, if we may believe Lactantius and Eusebius, he postponed his baptism, after the fashion of his times, until the very last year of his life, in order that, purified at once from all the stains of sin by means of it, he might be sure of entering into bliss. Such the explanation of those who would defend this delay of the emperors, but one cannot fail to remember that it was quite customary at this time among many professing the Christian religion to put off baptism, as long as they dared, that they might enjoy a life of sin, and then through the means of baptism, just before death, as by magic, obtain forgiveness. DHC 1 IV. Introduction. Constantine was not baptized into the church until 337 AD, only days before his death, the ceremony presided over by Eusebius, the personage of somewhat grievous notoriety. The early history of the church, Abdushane 271, it was well said that his baptism was an event that Constantine had been hedging all his life, trying to be a Christian to the Christians and heathen to heathens. Nicene and post-Nicene Fathers 1 556. By the turn of the 5th century, the gladiator schools were closed, and by 404 AD gladiator games were abolished. However, criminals and enemies were sent to the Colosseum to fight wild beasts for another 100 years. Some, but not all, of the practices of paganism began to disappear. However, many Roman customs, traditions and laws have continued to the present time. The leadership of Rome gradually changed from emperors to popes, and their standards of morality and marriage evolved accordingly. The sexual licentiousness under the emperor's monogamy changed to the strict moral ethics of the pope's celibacy from one end of the moral spectrum to the other. But even with this reversal from total sexual indulgence to complete abstinence, polygamy was still against the law. Ironically, plural marriage sanctioned by God was outlawed, but celibacy which was prohibited by God became a law for the priests. Living a celibate life was in direct opposition to such scriptures as therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. Gen. 2:24, and, be fruitful, and multiply, and replenish the earth. Gen. 1:28. When the Roman Empire and the Christian Church were unified, they both compromised their principles. In the process, the Christians lost some of their true principles and replaced them with some of the false Roman ones. The state might have had to yield, but now that it had protected the Church and showered privileges and wealth upon her, it demanded all the more her absolute surrender. Thus might the friendship of the Roman state have proved more dangerous than its enmity, and in the embrace of the empire, the spiritual power of the Church ran the risk of suffocation. Outlines of Church History, Rudolf Sohm, page 46. Persecution by the Romans was a means of purifying the Church, but when they were offered goodwill, favors, offices, wealth and power, it was poison to the body of the Christian religion. Roman laws became more and more acceptable to the Christians, and monogamy was one of them. Around the year 400 AD, restrictions increased for persons who wanted to become members of the priestly offices. Schaff reports. Catechumens, neophytes, persons baptized at the point of death, penitents, energumens, such as were possessed of a devil, actors, dancers, soldiers, curials, court, state, and municipal officials, slaves, eunuchs, bigamists, and all who led a scandalous life after baptism, were debarred from ordination. The frequenting of taverns and theaters, dancing and gambling, usury and the pursuit of secular business were forbidden to clergymen. Hist. Of the Christian Church, Schaff, 3:256. Varying views of who should live celibate lives were maintained by the Greek and Latin churches. In practice of clerical celibacy, however, the Greek and the Latin churches diverged in the 4th century and are to this day divided. The Greek church stopped halfway and limited the injunction of celibacy to the higher clergy, who were accordingly chosen generally from the monasteries or from the ranks of widower presbyters, while the Latin church extended the law to the lower clergy, and at the same time carried forward the hierarchical principle to absolute papacy. It sets virginity far above marriage and regards marriage only in its aspect of negative utility. In the single marriage of a priest it sees in a measure a necessary evil, at best only a conditional good, a wholesome concession to the flesh for the prevention of immorality, and requires of its highest office bearers total abstinence from all matrimonial intercourse. It wavers, therefore, between a partial permission and a partial condemnation of priestly marriage. In the East, one marriage was always allowed to the clergy, and at first even to bishops, and celibacy was left optional. Yet certain restrictions were early introduced, such as the prohibition of marriage after ordination, except in deacons and subdeacons, as well as of second marriage after baptism, the apostolic direction that a bishop should be the husband of one wife, being taken as a prohibition of successive polygamy, and at the same time as an allowance of one marriage. Besides second marriage, the marrying of a concubine, a widow, a harlot, a slave, and an actress was forbidden to the clergy. The Western Church, starting from the perverted and almost Manichaean ascetic principle that the married state is incompatible with clerical dignity and holiness, instituted a vigorous effort at the end of the 4th century to make celibacy, which had hitherto been left to the option of individuals, the universal law of the priesthood, thus placing itself in direct contradiction to the Levitical law, plural marriage, to which in other respects it made so much account of conforming. The first prohibition of clerical marriage, which laid claim to universal ecclesiastical authority, at least in the West, proceeded in 385 from the Roman Church, in the form of a decretal letter of the Bishop Siricius to Himerius, Bishop of Tarragona in Spain, who had referred several questions of discipline to the Roman bishop for decision. It is significant of the connection between the celibacy of the clergy and the interest of the hierarchy that the first properly papal decree, which was issued in the tone of supreme authority, imposed such an unscriptural, unnatural, and morally dangerous restriction. Ibid. Vol. 3. 242, 243, 247. Thus, Christianity emerged from years of persecution into the role of a national religion. It had struggled through divers troubles and inflictions, but with the church elevation, the poor, simple, devout disciple was lifted into executive offices of business and government. A new kind of man, proud and rich, with special privileges and immunities, replaced the humble disciple of previous years. It was a new church with new leaders, and it soon incorporated new doctrines and new laws. The emperors enacted and enforced the observation of the ecclesiastical as well as of the civil law. Theodosius and Gratian define or ratify the definition of doctrines, declare and condemn heretics. Justinian is a kind of caliph of Christianity, at once in the authoritative tone, and in the subjects which he comprehends under his decrees he is a pope and an emperor. The Emperor Justinian, having now reunited the Eastern and Western empires, aspired to be the legislator of the world, on Christendom and on the Roman Empire. According to his notions commensurate, he would bestow a full, complete, indefeasible code of law. Hist. Of Latin Christianity, Henry A. Millman, 2-4-5. In spite of all the rules and regulations against plural marriage, there seemed to be a continuous undercurrent of thinkers and writers who kept probing into the subject. Many prominent men both in and out of the church entered into that marriage system. Even some of the most recognized scholars of the Catholic Church wrote favorably of it. One such person was Saint Jerome, 331-420 AD. He was a student of Greek and Roman literature and became the literary secretary to Pope Donatus. Besides his many famous defensive letters in behalf of Christianity, his greatest work was translating the Bible into the Latin Vulgate, which became the Bible of Western Christendom until the Reformation. He ranks as one of the 4 doctors of the Latin Church. Asinius, a Roman nobleman, asked Jerome to back him in a protest against Carterius, a Spanish bishop, who acted contrary to the rule that a bishop should be the husband of one wife, because Carterius had married a second wife. At this time, 397 AD, even if a first wife died and a man married a second wife, it was considered polygamy. Jerome defended the bishop rather than siding with Asinius. A Spanish bishop named Carterius, old in years and in the priesthood, has married 2 wives, one before he was baptized, and, she having died, another since he has passed through the laver, and you are of opinion that he has violated the precept of the apostle, who in his list of episcopal qualifications commands that a bishop shall be the husband of one wife. I am surprised that you have pilloried an individual when the whole world is filled with persons ordained in similar circumstances. I do not mean presbyters or clergy of lower rank, but speak only of bishops, of whom if I were to enumerate them all one by one, I should gather a sufficient number to surpass the crowd which attended the Synod of Ariminum. Nicene and Post-Nicene Fathers, 6-142. The doctrine of the Catholic Church in those early days considered it plural marriage when anyone married for a second time, even if the second marriage was after the death of the first companion. However, even though it was a doctrine of the Church, many priests and leading members did not consider it a sin. Jerome once stated, "When one thing is good and another thing is better, when that which is good has a different reward from that which is better, and when there are more rewards than one, then, obviously, there exists a diversity of gifts. The difference between marriage and virginity is as great as that between not doing evil and doing good, or, to speak more favorably still, as that between what is good and what is still better." Moreover, when he, Paul, goes on to compare monogamy with digamy, a second legal marriage after the death or divorce of the first spouse, he puts digamy after monogamy, just as before he subordinated marriage to virginity. Can anyone, moreover, be so unfair in his criticism of my poor treatise as to allege that I condemn first marriages, when he reads my opinion on second ones as follows? The apostle, it is true, allows second marriages, but only to such as cannot contain, lest when they have begun to wax wanton against Christ, they marry, having condemnation because they have rejected their first faith, and he makes this concession, because many are turned aside after Satan. Having thus brought forward proofs that second marriages are allowed by the apostle, we at once added the remarks which follow. As marriage is permitted to virgins by reason of the danger of fornication, and as what in itself is not desirable is thus made excusable, so by reason of the same danger widows are permitted to marry a second time. I marked my own view of these practices with the words, "All things are lawful, but all things are not expedient." I do not condemn digamists nor yet trigamists, nor even, to put an extreme case, octogamists. Not to condemn is one thing, to commend is another. I may not praise it as meritorious. Nicene and Post-Nicene Fathers 670. Jerome said the Church had protected men from sins of all kinds, yet they worried about 2 lawful married wives. Jerome wrote, "All fornication and contamination with open vice, impiety towards God, parricide and incest, the change of the natural use of the sexes into that which is against nature, and all extraordinary lusts, are washed away in the fountain of Christ." Can it be possible that the stains of marriage are indelible, and that harlotry is judged more leniently than honorable wedlock? Ibid. Page 143. Jerome continued by saying that the church made it more tolerable for a man to be like the Scots in the Atticodi and the people of Plato's Republic, to have community of wives who were concubines or mistresses, rather than wedded wives. Ibid. Page 143, he quoted the scripture indicating that marriage is honorable and the bed undefiled, and spoke of Paul the Apostle. Paul knew that the law allowed men to have children by several wives, and was aware that the example of the patriarchs had made polygamy familiar to the people. Even the very priests might at their own discretion enjoy the same license. See Lev. 21:7-14. Ibid. Page 144. Jerome concludes his remarks by saying, I will ask you the following question: can a man who before his baptism has kept a concubine, and after her death has received baptism and has taken a wife, become a clergyman or not? You will answer me that he can, because his first partner was a concubine and not a wife. What the apostle condemns then, it would seem, is not mere sexual intercourse, but marriage contracts and conjugal rights. Many persons, we see, because of narrow circumstances, refuse to take upon them the burden of matrimony. Instead of taking wives, they live with their maidservants, and bring up as their own the children which these bear to them. Be careful therefore not to interpret the words the husband of one wife, that is, of one woman, as approving indiscriminate intercourse, and condemning only contracts of marriage. Ibid. Page 145. From these letters it can be seen how strange doctrines were soon coming into the church, and many of them aimed at condemning anything close to polygamy. The problems in polygamy can easily be doubled or tripled over those of a person living monogamy. As a matter of fact, a man who lives plural marriage should be a philosopher with a sense of humor. Saint Jerome gives a good example. Socrates had 2 wives, Xanthippe and Myron, granddaughter of Aristides. They frequently quarreled, and he was accustomed to banter them for disagreeing about him, he being the ugliest of men, with snub nose, bald forehead, rough-haired, and bandy-legged. At last they planned an attack upon him, and having punished him severely, and put him to flight, vexed him for a long time. On one occasion when he opposed Xanthippe, who from above was heaping abuse upon him, the termagant soused him with dirty water, but he only wiped his head and said, I knew that a shower must follow such thunder as that. Nicene and Post-Nicene Fathers, 6 384. Plural marriage had its difficulties at home and abroad, but its worst enemy was the Catholic Church. However, a few members, such as Jerome, ventured into the literary arena to justify the ancient prophets and their plural wives. Another was Saint Aurelius Augustine, 353–430 AD, who was one of the Christian fathers and wrote much on the history and doctrine of the early Christian church. His numerous letters, pamphlets and books have been continuously published and are still available. He lived and died in poverty, and began the Augustine order of monks, which Martin Luther joined over 1,000 years later. It is said that if Augustine had lived at the time of Luther, he would have been his colleague because much of what he wrote was not acceptable to the Catholic Church either. Augustine was a left-handed author with a pen frequently found in his hand. He was considered a philosophical and theological genius of the first order, towering like a pyramid above his age. And a heart full of Christian love and humility. Ibid. 1:7, his work spanned nearly every subject, yet some observers said he was more a thinker than a scholar, which made his works more readable and influential. For years, he was a gifted student, eventually opening his own school near Rome, where his fame spread widely. He was chosen as a professor at the imperial court, where his conversion to the church was said to have been first intellectual, then moral, and finally religious. After joining the church, he became a bishop and a doctor of philosophy and theology. He was considered to be the missionary who brought Christianity to England. His numerous pamphlets and books on theology are still used as missionary works and stand as classics in the field of theology. With all of his insight and depth of study, Augustine saw no fault in the practice of plural marriage. He defended the polygamy of the ancient prophets and patriarchs, even though customs and laws during his time were opposed to it. Among his work was a treatise in defense of Abraham, which he wrote in a letter to Faustus. Faustus, a member of the Manichaeans, an anti-Christian religious order, wrote to Augustine, objecting to many things done by the ancient prophets, including plural marriage. Augustine responded by saying, "You understand neither the symbols of the law nor the acts of the prophets, because you do not know what holiness or righteousness means." As if a deaf man, seeing others move their lips in speaking, were to find fault with the motion of the mouth as needless and unsightly, or as if a blind man passing his hand over the surface of the wall, and on coming to the windows, were to cry out against them as flaws in the level. or were to suppose that the wall had fallen in. Thus an irreligious pagan might bring the same reproaches against Christ in the Gospel as Faustus brings against God in the Old Testament. So also the patriarchs and prophets. I will not be content with showing them to be superior to your elect, who keep all the precepts of Manichaeus, but will prove their superiority to your God himself. First of all, then, not only the speech of these men, but their life also, was prophetic, and the whole kingdom of the Hebrews was like a great prophet, corresponding to the greatness of the person prophesied. So, as regards those Hebrews who were made wise in heart by divine instruction, we may discover a prophecy of the coming of Christ and of the Church, both in what they said and in what they did, and the same is true as regards the divine procedure towards the whole nation as a body. For, as the Apostle says, all these things were our examples. Those who find fault with the prophets, accusing them of adultery for instance, in actions which are above their comprehension, are like those pagans who profanely charge Christ with folly or madness, because he looked for fruit from a tree out of the season. Such critics are incapable of understanding that certain virtues in great minds resemble closely the vices of little minds, not in reality, but in appearance. Such resembles wisdom or the want of it, in reference to the grand moral distinction between virtue and vice. Reply to Faustus, the Manichaean, in Nicene and post-Nicene Fathers, c. 4 272-290. Augustine continued by saying that a man who obeys God, no matter what God requires, does not sin, which is in agreement with what Joseph Smith testified when he said, "Whatever God requires is right, no matter what it is." TPJS, page 256, Augustine explained further. Sin, then, is any transgression in deed, or word, or desire, of the eternal law. And the eternal law is the divine order or will of God, which requires the preservation of natural order, and forbids the breach of it. A man, therefore, who acts in obedience to the faith which obeys God, restrains all mortal affections, and keeps them within the natural limit, regulating his desires so as to put the higher before the lower. If there was no pleasure in what is unlawful, no one would sin. To sin is to indulge this pleasure instead of restraining it. And by unlawful is meant what is forbidden by the law in which the order of nature is preserved. Beasts do not sin, for their nature agrees with the eternal law from being subject to it, without being in possession of it. And again, angels do not sin, because their heavenly nature is so in possession of the eternal law, that God is the only object of its desire, and they obey his will without any experience of temptation. But man, whose life on this earth is a trial on account of sin, subdues to himself what he has in common with beasts, and subdues to God what he has in common with angels, till, when righteousness is perfected and immortality attained, he shall be raised from among beasts and ranked with angels. The exercise or indulgence of the bodily appetites is intended to secure the continued existence and the invigoration of the individual or of the species. If the appetites go beyond this, and carry the man, no longer master of himself, beyond the limits of temperance, they become unlawful and shameful lusts, which severe discipline must subdue. For as the eternal law that is, the will of God the Creator of all for the preservation of the natural order, permits the indulgence of the bodily appetite, under the guidance of reason in sexual intercourse, not for the gratification of passion, but for the continuance of the race through the procreation of children, so, on the contrary, the unrighteous law of the Manichaeans, in order to prevent their God, whom they bewail as confined in all seeds, from suffering still closer confinement in the womb, requires married people not on any account to have children, their great desire being to liberate their God. Instead, therefore, of an irrational craving in Abraham to have children, we find in Manichaeus an irrational fancy against having children. So the one preserved the natural order by seeking in marriage only the production of a child, while the other, influenced by his heretical notions, thought no evil could be greater than the confinement of his God. For Sarah did not connive at any criminal action in her husband for the gratification of his unlawful passions, but from the same natural desire for children that he had, and knowing her own barrenness, she warrantably claimed as her own the fertility of her handmaid. Not consenting with sinful desires in her husband, but requesting of him what it was proper in him to grant. Nor was it the request of proud assumption, for every one knows that the duty of a wife is to obey her husband. But in reference to the body, we are told by the apostle that the wife has power over her husband's body, as he has over hers, so that, while in all other social matters the wife ought to obey her husband, in this one matter of their bodily connection as man and wife their power over one another is mutual, the man over the woman, and the woman over the man. So, When Sarah could not have children of her own, she wished to have them by her handmaid, and of the same seed from which she herself would have had them, if that had been possible. No woman would do this if her love for her husband were merely an animal passion. She would rather be jealous of a mistress than make her a mother. So here the pious desire for the procreation of children was an indication of the absence of criminal indulgence. We may thus easily understand how Abraham, seeing that his wife was barren, and that she desired to obtain from her husband and her handmaid the offspring which she herself could not produce, acted not in compliance with carnal appetite, but in obedience to conjugal authority. Believing that Sarah had the sanction of God for her wish, because God had already promised him an heir from his own body, but had not foretold who was to be the mother. Abraham was not an adulterer when, in submission to the lawful authority of his wife, he consented to be made a father by his wife's handmaid. But, from the nature of the relationship, for a wife to have two husbands, both in life, is not the same thing as for a man to have two wives. So that we regard the explanation already given of Abraham's conduct as the most correct and unobjectionable. Jacob, the son of Isaac, is charged with having committed a great crime because he had 4 wives. But here there is no ground for a criminal accusation, for a plurality of wives was no crime when it was the custom. There are sins against nature, and sins against custom, and sins against the laws. In which, then, of these senses did Jacob sin in having a plurality of wives? As regards nature, he used the women not for sensual gratification, but for the procreation of children. For custom, this was the common practice at that time in those countries. And for the laws, no prohibition existed. Augustine gave a punch at Faustus when he stated. And so the mistake arises of supposing that no one could ever have had many wives, but from sensuality and the vehemence of sinful desires. Unable to form an idea of men whose force of mind is beyond their conception, they compare themselves with themselves, as the Apostle says, and so make mistakes. Conscious that, in their intercourse though with one wife only, they are often influenced by mere animal passion, instead of an intelligent motive, they think it an obvious inference that, if the limits of moderation are not observed where there is only one wife, the infirmity must be aggravated where there are more than one. But those who have not the virtues of temperance must not be allowed to judge of the conduct of holy men. Augustine wrote many pages of justification and explanation for plural marriage, and his arguments and reasoning are logical, original, and have a depth of understanding not often found in other defenses of polygamy. John Cairncross acknowledged and respected these great Catholic scholars for their honesty. Not only is there nothing in the Bible contrary to polygamy, the fathers of the Church, Augustine and Jerome, did not condemn it in the Old Testament. In early Christian times, it was common. Even Charlemagne had several wives. It was only the evil spirit which prevented polygamy from becoming customary. Gradually priestcraft became more and more powerful. It is all the fault of the devil in Rome. The Church imposed not only monogamy but the celibacy of the priests, and also church control of marriage, which had formerly been a civil affair. After polygamy was made a sin, Cairncross, page 80. Will Durand said that during the years 511–614 AD the heads of France generated an aristocracy. They were proud of their long beards and silken robes, and almost as polygamous as any Moslem save Muhammad. Story of Civilization 493, even in 628 King Dagobert had 3 wives. Justinian II summoned a council to meet in Constantinople in 692. This council group claimed all the privileges that the Pope of Rome did in his council decisions. One of the new doctrines permitted marriage to deacons and presbyters, and condemned the Roman prohibition of such marriages. The Greek Church still maintains this permission. A History of the Christian Church, W. Walker, 2–147. Charlemagne the Great, 742–841, succeeded to the throne as king of the Franks and annexed France and a large part of Germany. In 800 AD he was proclaimed Caesar by Pope Leo III. As an emperor, he spread Christianity and learning throughout the empire. See New Modern Enc. Page 213. Strangely enough, this man had several wives. For many years the leadership of the Roman Catholic Church had mixed opinions on plural marriage, and apparently the popes never instigated any definite doctrine against it until the year 866. The occasion was when Prince Bogoris of Bulgaria, with many of his people, joined the church. Plural marriage was a major concern to them, so they wrote to the Pope for the official view on the subject. Pope Nicholas I wrote, "Therefore, if one is found to have 2 wives at the same time, he is to be compelled to lose one and keep the first." Can polygamy be compatible with Christianity? Jesuit priest Francisco Arusha, page 275. In 1201, Pope Innocent III explained that plural marriage was lived in ancient times for two reasons. The Old Testament apparent acceptance of polygamy, which theology for a long time interpreted in terms of a dispensation for the multiplication of God's chosen people, is one, and without any doubt that it was never licit to anyone unless it was granted by divine revelation. Ibid. Page 277. With two such good reasons, one could question why it should not be continued today. But this Catholic bar against plural marriage has continued up to recent times. On March 5, 1980, Pope John Paul II spoke in Zaire, Africa, and asked the Africans to give up their plural wives. The Catholic Church, like the Mormon, has gone through gradual changes in their beliefs and practices, but true principles, eternal laws and perpetual ordinances do not change. Saint Thomas Aquinas, 1225-1274, called the Angelic Doctor, was an Italian Dominican friar. He was the most famous and probably the most influential of the medieval scholastic philosophers. His extensive education qualified him to be a professor of theology at the University of Paris. For 9 years he studied, wrote, and taught at papal courts in Italy, and organized a center of theological studies. Thomas's most famous work, the Summa Theologica, is a vast, closely argued summary of his doctrinal position on almost all subjects. He wrote many other works besides, such as commentaries, a series of major works on special topics, numerous exegetical works, explanations of the four Gospels, and minor works of considerable variety. From the foregoing brief description of Thomas's doctrine, it should be apparent that Thomas accomplished a vast architectonic union of theology and philosophy. His Summa Theologica is aptly named American People's Inc. 1820-122. Here was a profound thinker whose mind ranged over every aspect of men's lives and became one of the greatest intellectual lights of the Catholic Church. Even though the Church had made an objection to plural marriage about 400 years before Thomas's time, he still maintained a respect for that principle and those who lived it. Catholic priest Father Hillman stated, Thomas Aquinas also understood the sacramentality of marriage in such a way as to allow, at least theoretically, for a plurality of wives. In answering those who felt that fidelity and the sacrament could not possibly be maintained when one man is joined to several wives, St. Thomas affirmed that fidelity and the sacrament were not entirely absent in a polygamous union. Polygamy Reconsidered, Hillman, page 203. In Thomas's own words, he wrote, Now the faith to be kept with God is of greater import than the faith to be kept with a wife, which is reckoned a marriage good, and than the signification which pertains to the sacrament, since the signification is subordinate to the knowledge of faith. Hence it is not unfitting if something is taken from the two for the sake of the good of offspring. Nor are they entirely done away, since there remains faith towards several wives, and the sacrament remains after a fashion, for though it did not signify the union of Christ with the Church as one, nevertheless the plurality of wives signified the distinction of degrees in the Church, which distinction is not only in the Church militant, but also in the Church triumphant. Consequently their marriages signified somewhat the union of Christ, not only with the Church militant, as some say, but also with the Church triumphant where there are many mansions. John 19:2, Summa Theologiae, Supplement, page 65. Going back in time, the Northmen were Teutons who came up through Denmark into Sweden and Norway. An early chief, Dan Michelotti, gave his name to Denmark. Dan's March. Norge, or Norway, was taken from the North Way. Their chiefs in the 10th century made inroads to those countries. Harold Bluetooth, 945-85, gave Denmark Christianity, and King Olav Skotkonung made Sweden Christian. These great leaders often had wives and concubines. For instance, a leader called Halfdan the Black subdued most of Norway to become its first king. His son Harald Harfager, 860-933, was challenged by rebellious chieftains. The Jida whom he wooed refused to marry him until he should conquer all Norway. He vowed never to clip or comb his hair till it was done. He accomplished it in 10 years, married Jida and 9 other women, cut his hair, and received his distinguishing name the Fair-Haired. Olaf, son of Tryggve, was a great-grandson of Harald of the Fair Hair. He was a very merry, frolicsome man, said Snorri of Iceland, gay and social, very generous, and finical in his dress. Stout and strong, the handsomest of men, excelling in bodily exercises every Northman that ever was heard of. He could run across the oars outside his ship while men were rowing, could juggle 3 sharp-pointed daggers, could cast 2 spears at once, and could cut equally well with either hand. Many a quarrel he had, and many an adventure. While in the British Isles he was converted to Christianity and became its merciless advocate. When he was made King of Norway, 995, he destroyed pagan temples, built Christian churches, and continued to live in polygamy. The Bonders opposed the new religion fiercely and demanded that Olaf should make sacrifice to Thor as in the ancient ritual. He agreed, but proposed to offer Thor the most acceptable sacrifice, the leading Bonders themselves, whereupon they became Christians. Another Olaf, called the Saint, reunited Norway, 1016, restored order, gave righteous judgment, and completed the conversion of the land to Christianity. He was a good and very gentle man, says Snorri, of little speech, and open-handed, but greedy of money and slightly addicted to concubines. The Story of Civilization, Will Durant, 4 500-203. It was obvious at this time that both Catholic and Protestant theologians could accept the doctrinal aspect of plural marriage, but not the practice of it. That does not mean no one lived it. Even emperors such as Charlemagne, Lothair and Pepin had officially accepted several wives. Cairncross noted. It is worth recalling that, in the 13th century, Frederick II, the master of southern Italy, carried over the traditions left by the long Muslim occupation of Sicily, by himself keeping a harem, and by officially tolerating polygamy among his Christian subjects. There is no record of a papal protest against his policy. After polygamy was made a sin, page 64. It is recorded that Montezuma, the king of Mexico, had a very large family of wives and children. Historian A.F. Pillard stated that in 1437 King Henry IV of Castile